Mark Gober is the award-winning author of the Upside Down series of 7 books published since 2018. The books span the topics of consciousness, politics, economics, medicine, cosmology, and more. He also produced the popular 8-episode podcast series, Where Is My Mind, with Blue Duck Media. Previously, Gober worked in investment banking in New York with UBS and was a partner at Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley. He graduated magna cum laude from Princeton, where he was elected a captain of the tennis team. And you can find out more about him in the show notes. And also, please check out episode 60 of The Way Forward with Alec Zeck, where we discuss his book and Into Upside Down Medicine. This one, we're going to be discussing, I think overwhelmingly, I'm sure we'll get into consciousness as you tend to with all of your books and topics. That's where it all leads back to, is an Into the Upside Down Cosmos. And you can find that in the show notes as well. I'm super stoked to be talking about this at this point in history, because in the past couple of days, as several of you who are listening or watching might be aware, there was a group of people who participated in what was called the final experiment, which I wholly disagree with the title, and we'll explain why in this case. But they traveled to Antarctica, and it was comprised of people who believe that the Earth is a globe and people who do not believe that the Earth is a globe, and traveled to Antarctica to see if there was indeed 24 hours of sunlight. And there's 24 hours of sunlight. And so now we're presented with a lot of people saying that this is the end for flat Earth. And I think the other big claim is that this proves the globe. So why is that statement in and of itself problematic?
We need to start with a logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent. I find myself talking about this all the time because it applies not only to cosmology, not only to medicine, but like anything we hear. It has to do with the notion of causality, basically what caused something to happen. And the way that I like to explain it now is just because an explanation or a model can adequately explain an observation doesn't mean that that model is correct. Let me give my favorite example that many others have used as well. If you go outside and see that the grass is wet, do you conclude it rained last night? That is one possibility. But there are many other reasons for wet grass, like sprinkler systems or dew or interdimensional beings entering our dimension and pouring water on the grass. The point is, we could come up with a million explanations as to why there's wet grass. And what often happens is people get stuck into one model. It rained last night. And then any new observation is force fit into that model. Mm-hmm. So with regard to the quote unquote final experiment, it is true that the conventional globe model can adequately explain what was observed, but that doesn't mean that's the only model that could explain what was observed.
Right. Right. That's a really good way to put it. And the example that I like to give, in addition to the rain one, is, let's say we're at a basketball game in the 1950s, and every time we see a dunk occur, the crowd goes, ooh, that specific ooh, right? And at one point during the game, I'm bending down, tying my shoes, and I say the 1950s because we don't have cell phones at the time, so let's just play with that example. But at one point during the game, I'm bending down, tying my shoes, and you're still watching the game sitting right next to me. I hear ooh. I hear the effect of the crowd going, ooh. So I look up to you and I say, oh, a dunk must have happened, because the crowd going, ooh, is proof of a dunk. And you say, no, Alec, that's not what happened. Actually, the referee just got punched. I'm like, no. The crowd going, ooh, is proof of a dunk. The point that we're getting at here is pointing to effects as proof of the cause without first establishing the only way that effect can occur is because of said cause, is an affirming the consequent logical fallacy. And that's what a lot of people do with all areas. So this applies not only to cosmology, but applies in so many other areas. But I think I'd like to start with, after we've answered that, what led to the formation of this book in the first place? Because you're a freaking machine, man. Like, you're a machine when it comes to book writing. And I just like the story of how this book even came about.
Well, in some ways, I can thank you for this one, just like I can thank you for the medicine book.
That's why I said to bring it up. I'm just kidding.
Because last year, I was here in Texas interviewing about my book and Into Upside Down Medicine. And after the interview, you said, I'm throwing this conference called Confluence. You got to come. And I was like, I don't really know what that is, but okay, I'm in. and that was April of 2024. And when I attended that conference, it was right after Steve Young's book came out, A Fool's Wisdom, and he's a theoretical physics PhD. And right before going to Confluence, because everyone was talking about it, I got his book. And among other things, he talks about his journey as someone who's conventionally trained in physics. And he was confronted with beliefs that challenged the spinning globe model of Earth. At first, he dismissed it and then spent years on it. And he says in the book, I don't know with 100% certainty what Earth is, but I know with 100% certainty that it's not a spinning globe. And that was kind of a mic drop for me to read someone with his academic stature saying that. Like, that should never happen with someone so well educated. If there's even one person, and you don't even know how many other people might have skepticism as well who haven't written books. And the way he explained things in a very simplistic way helped me at least understand what people were talking about. Then I went to Confluence, and people were talking about spinning globe model, or challenges to the spinning globe and flat Earth and all these things. And I didn't have a firm opinion on it. And some people were asking me, what do you think about it? And I also noticed a lot of people who were challenging germ theory and virology were also challenging cosmology using the same logical fallacy arguments. Basically, that in mainstream medicine, there are logical fallacies that lead us to conclude things that might not be true. And they're saying, if you apply this way of thinking to cosmology, you end up in a similar place. So the wheels start turning in my mind, because I had heard people talk about flat Earth. I had heard Dave Weiss several years before. And I remember thinking there's some interesting points here, but there's just so much to unpack. And I was working on other things. And for whatever reason, I got roped into it after several conversations at Confluence. One I remember with Yerasimos and Melly Neubeck, but maybe the last day they were talking about it, and they're like, why does this topic matter? What the shape of the Earth is? And I was just listening to what they're saying, and then I know so many other people think it's such a big deal. And then I went home, started looking into it a bit more, and got resources from a number of people, including Kelly Brogan, who just had some places to start in terms of what the arguments are. Mm-hmm. And I spent a few days on that, like devouring a lot of these resources. And I came to a very similar place where I've been before writing other books of, there's a lot here. I don't really know what's true yet, but this is super important and I've got to look into it more deeply. Mm-hmm. That's the origin story. The more I looked, the more I realized there's an argument to be made here. And for all of my books, I find that there's a part of me that's not sure if I can do it. Like, number one, are the arguments good enough? And number two, if they're good enough, is this something I can publish? Mm-hmm. Will my publisher allow it? Because I just send the manuscripts to my publisher and I never know what they're going to think. And I concluded that there was enough here to challenge the conventional model. And before I pause, I want to give a framing here that I don't hear enough of, that it was compelling enough for me to say, we need to start from scratch with regard to cosmology. Two main points. One is that if you talk to any mainstream physicist or cosmologist, they will acknowledge that only 4% of the universe, using the conventional models and laws of physics, can be explained. 96% is dark matter and dark energy, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. This mysterious stuff that you basically have to plug in order for all the math to work. I know I'm simplifying it, but that is a huge deal, which means that even from a conventional way of thinking, we don't understand what's going on in the universe. Mm-hmm. That's big. 96% of the universe is a big mystery, and maybe that 96% isn't even there in the way that they think it is. Mm-hmm. That's point one. Point two is that physicists will acknowledge there is no unifying theory of everything that can reconcile the two leading theories of physics. One is relativity theory, which is often believed to describe like galactic big scale movements, and quantum mechanics, which is believed to explain small scale things, even though quantum should apply to everything. But there's no reconciliation of these two leading theories, which apparently they work well in their respective domains. But when you put them together, metaphorically speaking, the equations blow up. Mm-hmm. So I quote Michio Kaku in my book, who's a mainstream physicist, and he talks about this crisis in cosmology, basically, that there's this massive mismatch to the effect of 10 to the 120th power, that they're off. And he says this is like, I believe he says this is the biggest mismatch in the history of physics or cosmology. I'm paraphrasing. Mm-hmm. But that should tell us right there, 96% of the universe is unexplained, and we have no unifying theory of physics that can reconcile the two leading theories. Something big is wrong. And that means that those who say, well, the conventional model of how things work in the universe, that it's good enough for me.
Right.
That can explain things really well. No, it can't on its face.
Right.
96%, no unifying theory. Like, I hope your audience just repeats that in your mind, because there's a tendency to say, well, I can explain this with the heliocentric model. Earth revolves around the sun. well, maybe one model can explain certain observations, like we were saying, but beware of affirming the consequent. Just because a model can explain certain things doesn't mean it's the correct model, and the current model has some very big holes.
Right. Right. That's so well said. And I think all the things that you're pointing to there regarding relativity and regarding like the quantum model of things ultimately ties into heliocentrism. And that's the thing that people miss when it comes to this, is what you're pointing to is that there are huge gaping holes with heliocentrism itself, because it is inextricably linked to both of those things that you were just bringing up earlier. And you said we might cover dark matter later, and that's actually what I wanted to cover next. So could we go a little bit more deeper into dark matter and what you uncovered?
Yeah, and this is how I start the book, actually, because I think it's the mic drop in my own mind of how I think about it. It maybe gave me the confidence to write the book, if I really reverse engineer this, because I started my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, talking about dark matter and dark energy, and so much is a mystery, and therefore we should question the nature of reality and question the nature of consciousness. But what I didn't do was look back at what those entities are, and dark matter in particular I like to talk about because of some recent findings. So dark matter was quote unquote discovered, and you'll see why I say quote unquote discovered, in 1933 by an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky, who was observing a cluster of galaxies called the Coma Cluster. And basically, the way the galaxies were behaving did not line up with Einstein's theory of gravity, the general relativity theory, which came after Newton's gravity. So it's sort of like a revision. And there was missing mass. Basically, there needed to be much more matter present in order to explain the observations. And it wasn't like the amount of missing mass was off by a tiny bit. There was under 1% of the amount of mass that should have been there, and it wasn't there. So there were basically two options as I see it, decades later. One is they discovered that there must be matter that we don't understand called dark matter, and that's the prevailing theory. So that's where we are. There's just something we don't understand, and that's how we can preserve Einstein's relativity and gravity. The other possibility is maybe gravity's wrong and Einstein was wrong, and they just plug something in. It's known as a post hoc rationalization in order to preserve the model.
Can I explain what that is just real quick?
Yeah.
What he's saying, post hoc rationalization, is essentially where you come up with a rescue device in order to explain away an example in which aspect of a model was falsified. So you falsify something. For example, what virologists do, because I'm sure many of you are aware of the arguments on virology, is they claim that the reason you can't find virus particles inside the fluids of a sick person is because there's not enough present inside the fluids, or the virus is too weak to isolate or purify from the fluids. So when you show that you can't even find this in the fluids, which is what they claim, right, thus falsifying their claim, they come up with a rescue device in order to explain away why they were failed to validate that claim.
Tom Cowan calls it inventive reasoning.
Yeah.
You just invent something out of thin air, and then you can preserve the model. Because think about how disruptive it would be if we had to rethink gravity completely.
Right.
And the next step is where I really got interested, which is that recently an astrophysicist named Pavel Krupa at the University of Bonn in Germany. So this is someone who has a Wikipedia page, a mainstream credible astrophysicist, has been working with his colleagues around the world for over 2 decades looking at dark matter, because this is a very popular area of physics. And he claims they have falsified dark matter with more than 5 sigma confidence, which is like 99.99+%, meaning that the observations you would expect based on the theory of dark matter are not found.
Wow. So
to me, it seems like a cosmological house of cards. And let's just start from the beginning here with gravity, because I do think it's important to examine the fundamentals of physics that uphold the conventional model.
Right.
Newton's gravity is the idea that an apple falls to the ground because the mass of Earth is greater than the mass of the apple, and mass attracts mass. That's the basic theory. And we're trying to explain. We all know an apple falls to the ground. The question is, what is causing that to occur?
Let me stop. I just want to emphasize this over and over again. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but it's important to emphasize this. No one is denying the effect of apples falling to the ground. No one is denying that effect. Not Mark, not really anyone else who's a serious skeptic of the accepted model, let's say. We're not denying the effects. We're trying to determine what is the true cause of those effects. Okay, sorry. Please proceed.
Yeah, very important. We're not denying The question is gravity the cause?
Right.
Is it because that mass has some magical force within it where mass attracts mass? It is kind of a mystical idea,
Right.
Newton's notion of gravity. Or is there something else going on? And many people talk about Newton's gravity as a law, like colloquially, but it is unable to explain certain phenomena, like Mercury's motion. It cannot explain it.
Mhm.
So this gets to maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. The idea I talk about in the book that if there's a law that says that all swans are white, and you find a million white swans all over the world, and there's a single black swan, that means your law is incorrect because all means all. We can't just sweep these anomalies under the rug. So the point is there are some issues with Newton's gravity, even though it might be able to explain certain things, like we said earlier. Just because you can explain certain phenomena doesn't mean it's the correct model.
Right.
So there are problems with Newton's gravity. And Einstein's relativity, general relativity in particular, came along later, and it's supposed to be more precise. It's not that mass is attracting mass per se. It's actually that mass is bending space-time, so it looks like the bigger object is attracting the smaller object to it, but it's a more refined version of Newton's gravity. And then we just talked about what happened in 1933, that you need to plug in dark matter in order for the math to work out because there was missing mass in these observations. And now Pavel Krupa and his colleagues are talking about falsifying dark matter. So what is the ripple effect here? Is this a falsification of the current conception of gravity? And we have to rethink motion, basically? That maybe there's something else going on that's not being considered by mainstream physicists. Now, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I've had some fun with AI on this topic, just going through the logic of it. Because I've done a lot with AI, ChatGPT, and Gemini, and Claude by Anthropic to question virology, but I've expanded it to other topics. And it's interesting when you bring up the dark matter topic, because your audience might want to do this, say, like, what's the relationship between dark matter and gravity? And it doesn't make these connections, but eventually it will. It will say, like, the theory of gravity is really contingent upon the existence of dark matter. And wait a second, the spinning globe model is really contingent on the notion of gravity as it's currently conceived, because how could water stick to a ball? Like the oceans of Earth, they stick to the ball and they don't fall
Predicated on gravity.
On gravity.
Right.
So the way AI looks at it, and I'm not saying that's the final answer, is that the falsification of dark matter makes the spinning globe impossible. So just think about it logically. You need gravity for a spinning globe. Dark matter is required to uphold Einstein's relativity, which was needed to uphold Newton's gravity. Dark matter is being falsified. What's going on here?
Right. So again, say the confidence interval of this physicist in the modern age who has a Wikipedia page, really well-known physicist, who has said that his team has falsified dark matter.
Yeah, it's more than 5 sigma, so 99.999+% odds that his results are significant.
Yep.
So the way dark matter is currently conceived is not matching observations. And anyone can look this up. There's some really good articles on iai.tv. Look up Pavel Krupa. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, that the current cosmological model is wrong. We need something new. We need to rethink Einstein's gravity.
Yeah. Wow. That's big. That's a really big deal. Really, really big deal. So where I think I want to go next, and I'll let you sort of guide this conversation. Obviously, you know your book better than I do. I have read it, and I got to say it's incredible. So I think that like you will get a lot out of listening and watching this podcast, but I cannot stress enough the importance of reading what Mark wrote on paper on his book. Like it is incredibly important in order to really digest and understand this topic. But where I thought I wanted to go next was the 9 statements. The one, falsifying one model does not require a viable, complete alternate model. So I'll just read off the statements and then you just expand upon them. So in your book, you talk about these 9 statements. And one of those, the first one, is falsifying one model does not require having a viable, complete alternative model. So we'd already discussed that a little bit, but please expand upon it as it relates to Earth, cosmology, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency, whether it's in science or even politics, where if there's a conventional way of looking at the world and a challenge comes in to that way of looking at the world, but there isn't a replacement given to say, well, I think it's this instead, people are inclined to say, well, I'm just going to go with what has been believed for a long time. And the example I give in my book, and there are a bunch of others as well, is if you imagine we're taking a multiple choice test in school, and the teacher says, you need to come back with me. You need to come back to me with one answer. The answer is either A, B, C, or D. And I spent a bunch of time on this. You spent a bunch of time on it. And you come to me and you're like, Mark, I'm convinced it's A for these reasons. And I say, I hear you on all that, but I actually spent all week on A, and I can show you these are the reasons why A is absolutely not it. And you're like, those are some good points, Mark, but you got to tell me, is it B, C, or D? And I say, well, I don't know because I haven't done that analysis yet. And then you say to me, okay, well, then we must go with A. It has to be A if you can't tell me if it's B, C, or D. It's absurd, but that's how this works often. So if we talk about a falsification of cosmology or mainstream medicine, the tendency of most people is, well, if you can't tell me what the answer is, then we're going to go with the other one. We're going to go with what has been believed before. And I find I start the book off, it's actually dedicated to those who are comfortable with three important words. I don't know.
Right.
And that's where I find myself with regard to cosmology, because and it might be beyond our comprehension, the actual answer. So seem to be many falsifications to the mainstream cosmological model, but I can't tell you that I know with any certainty what the true model is.
Right.
And whether that's the shape or the nature of Earth's place in the solar system, or the solar system, quote unquote, place in the cosmos, whether the Big Bang happened the way that's described, all those things, I don't have the answer for that. But there are many holes in what we're told about a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, leading to Earth revolving around the sun and Earth having this very specific shape with a specific radius value and so forth. So it's okay to be like, well, I can show you how your model's wrong. And then someone says, well, what is the alternative? And I can say, I don't know. That's actually okay.
Yeah, it's completely fine. Yeah. And another example that I like to give, just again, I think giving endless examples on this is important. The one that you shared with the multiple choice quiz is really good. The other one, to make it, I guess, more real when it comes to something that might put someone away for life, you could say, is the example of a murder case. Let's say Aaron swears that he saw Bill murder Chuck at a gas station or something like that, right? And there's CCTV footage from Bill's apartment complex showing him, or someone that looks like him, rather, someone that's tall, same height as him, maybe wearing a similar hoodie, leaving the apartment complex that Bill lives at, heading to the gas station. And then there's CCTV footage at the gas station that Aaron owns where someone that is wearing the same hoodie, same height, murders Chuck and then drives away. And so Bill is being brought up on murder charges for murdering Chuck. But then when the court case happens, Bill comes up and says, actually, no, on this date of the murder, I was actually in Thailand. I have all the plane receipts. I have, a bunch of pictures. I have text messages between me and my wife. I even did an Instagram live on the day of the murder in Thailand, thus falsifying the idea that I was the cause for Chuck's murder. Bill has thoroughly falsified that idea that he was the one who committed Chuck's murder. Everyone would agree that it would be absurd for the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, and everyone to say, you know what? You did falsify this idea that it was you. But until you can come up with a better explanation for who did commit the murder, we're just going to stick with you. That'd be absurd. But that's what everyone is doing when it comes to this topic and many other topics. When you falsify one idea, that does not mean you have to have a better replacement for that idea. Falsification does not require replacement, and you don't need to know what is to clearly know and, falsify what clearly isn't, right? So the second thing you bring up is the black swans falsify a model. That's the second statement. So let's touch on that a little bit too.
Yeah, it's worth repeating. If the law says all swans are white, and we find 10 billion white swans in one day, there's a single black swan, it means the law does not work. So that means if there are quote unquote anomalies that don't fit a model, those need to be paid attention to rather than swept under the rug. And this has been a theme for me for all the books I've written, is that I end up coming across these anomalies that don't fit the model that we're told is true. And we can't sweep those under the rug. It's enough to say, if this one thing doesn't match your model, that means the model is not comprehensive. It's not able to account for all phenomena. And we see this all over the place, but especially in cosmology. It's like, well, the model works pretty well. It can explain things, and I understand my place in the universe, and there might be these anomalies we don't need to worry about. When actually there are things that falsify the model.
And both of these two, the first one, falsifying one model does not require having a viable, complete alternative model, and Black Swan's falsify model relate to the principle. I think it's a Vedic principle, the neti-neti principle.
Yeah.
Am I correct in that? It's Vedic, right?
Vedic.
Okay, yeah.
The idea of getting to enlightenment by saying not this, not that.
Yeah.
So you get to the truth by finding out what's not true, and you narrow down the possibilities of what is true. And credit to Tom Cowan. I think I heard him say that first, because I had studied that principle when I was looking at spiritual philosophy, and he was applying it to virology. It's a very important way of looking at things, because I'm finding as I look at more and more esoteric areas that it's hard to know exactly what is true, but there just seems to be these little things that don't fit the models that are not paid attention to, and then it helps us narrow down the possibilities of things that we should be looking at.
Right. The third one is double standards are everywhere in debates about cosmology. Could you touch on that?
It kind of ties in with the Black Swans idea, which is like, I'm willing to tolerate some anomalies that my model cannot accommodate. But if there's one little thing that you can't explain to me, then your model's done. Mm-hmm. And we see this with cosmology very often, especially with regard to the shape of Earth or the nature of what Earth is. The classic alternative that's put forth, I would call it a framework, not a model, because it's actually impossible to come up with a model of Earth, right, which we should talk about later.
Yes.
We don't have the observational capacity right now to have a comprehensive model, but there is a framework that many people talk about where Earth is it's a topographical plane, and there sometimes in a debate you'll hear someone ask one question about cosmology that this model needs to explain, and maybe the person hasn't thought about it or doesn't have an explanation for it yet, and it's like that's enough for them to say, okay, your model, which isn't even a model, it doesn't work, and we should shut down the conversation. Whereas within their own conventional cosmology, they have been unable to explain many things, like no unifying theory of physics, 96% of the universe, dark matter, dark energy, and other things that we haven't talked about yet.
And then the fourth one is observations do not on their own reveal the cause of those observations. We touched on this a little bit, but it's still important to hit it again.
It is. This is affirming the consequence, where, a model that can explain something is not necessarily the correct model. So important. The globe model can explain the observations in Antarctica. Does that mean the globe model is the only one that could explain the observations? We don't know that. Maybe there are other things. And often something that goes along with this is that there could be elements to the nature of reality that we cannot comprehend.
Right.
So the explanation set that we have right now with current physics and current technology is limited. So there might be things outside of what we even know that might explain.
I think about this a lot as it relates to even the claim that human beings can only perceive 0.0035% of the available electromagnetic spectrum. First off, that's crazy in and of itself. But how do we know with certainty what is the full electromagnetic spectrum? You know what I mean?
It's a great question.
Like, even if that is true, that's crazy to think about, because that means that we, with our senses, can only perceive less than 1% of what is happening all around us, right? But that was derived based on human instrumentation in order to come up with what is the, quote, available electromagnetic spectrum.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Completely.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with auditory stuff that we can only hear, but how do we know what's the full spectrum of frequency that exists?
Right.
And when we start getting into the nature of consciousness, the nature of reality, which I do later in the book, it blows everything up, because there seems to be a reality that's beyond what our perceptual organs show us to be true.
Absolutely. And that's why, I think it's so important to continue to hit on, until you thoroughly falsify all of the other possible explanations for this phenomenon that you are witnessing, you can't say that phenomenon that you are witnessing is proof of what you think it is. Again, that's affirming the consequent, and we can come up with countless examples of that. But I think that is one of the most important points to stress, because you see that happen all over the place. You see it happen, for example, with SARS-CoV-2 claims and COVID claims that I lost my taste and smell. That is proof of a virus. But just a few weeks ago, a guy on Twitter sent me an example of I think LA Times article that showed loss of taste and smell was a commonly accepted phenomenon even back then, and even people losing their taste and smell for 6 months or more was pretty frequent back then. So it's not new at all, and it's not specific to any so-called, quote, SARS-CoV-2 virus. But again, the same applies to cosmology. Okay, the fifth one, the celestial bodies in the sky look and behave, or the way the celestial bodies in the sky look and behave doesn't necessarily imply that the Earth looks and behaves in the same way.
I've heard Dave Weiss describe it as, can we tell what the floor is like by looking at the ceiling?
Right.
It's a fallacy to say that I take out my telescope and I see something in the sky and therefore Earth is a certain way. Because it presupposes that Earth often, if we're talking about other planets that people see in their telescope, by saying the word other, they're implying that Earth is a planet, which presupposes a very specific type of cosmology in which Earth is in a solar system where everything's revolving around the sun. So all those things would need to be unpacked first. So it's just fallacious to say that Earth isn't something different based on what we see elsewhere. But this gets us into the Copernican principle, which is a philosophical notion that Earth does not occupy a special place in the cosmos. And it's so deeply embedded that to think that Earth might be special or different than other things in the sky, it's like, what are you, arrogant? And actually, Stephen Hawking, and I quote many other physicists, he says, we believe it on principles of modesty. And it's amazing how much of that Copernican principle has shaped observations in cosmology, where actual models, like the Big Bang even, arguably, Edwin Hubble talked about the expanding universe. Many of his observations were created, or the model created around those observations were designed to preserve the idea that Earth does not occupy a special place, because he said it would be a horror, it would be intolerable if we did. And this gets us into spiritual topics, because if Earth does occupy a special place, if Earth is special relative to the other lights in the sky, what does that imply about creation or some kind of intelligence and spirituality and religion? So this is a very deep topic. Just from that one logical fallacy that I hear so many people say, well, those things are round based on what we see, therefore Earth is something. One other comment on this is it just has to do with the nature of observation, aside from the fact that who knows whether our eyes show us what's actually real, which is a deeper philosophical question. Right. But if our eyes do show us what's real, often we're seeing things and we are interpreting their full shape. So like the moon, what do we actually see? We're seeing a disc shape. We're seeing something that's circular. There's a difference between a circle and a sphere. Mm-hmm. So we end up inferring often of, well, the spherical part must be there.
Right.
And I'm not saying anything conclusive, but we have to make that same...
You're not stating that the moon is not or is. You're not saying that. But what we observe with our own two eyes is just a disc shape. That's what we observe with our own two eyes.
Right. And the same thing goes with a lot of NASA imagery where we see of Earth. So it's just something to keep in mind that we will create a visual model of something that's an inference. And the same thing happens in virology when you have a static image from an electron microscope of dead tissue of that's supposed to be a virus, and those people will say, well, it's budding out, but it's actually static. So they end up creating a model of something that's moving when it's actually static. The point is we have to be very careful about extrapolations visually.
One of the things you said, though, that I want to revisit is related to what's it called? The
Copernican principle.
The Copernican principle. And it's just crazy to think about how this entire framework for how the accepted mainstream cosmological view has come about is ultimately largely because of people who did not want to buy into the idea or the possibility that the Earth does hold a special place, that all of the things that followed were based on the starting point that they do not want to accept that we might hold a special place in reality. That's crazy. That's like crazy to think about.
And that there could be models in which Earth does occupy a special place based on what we've observed. But one model has been adopted because it preserves the idea that Earth is not in a special place. And there's a documentary on this called The Principle, produced by Robert Sungenis. It's all about the Copernican principle and has many physicists who are quoted, so your audience might be interested in that.
Okay, awesome. I'll throw that in the show notes too. Okay, I think you touched on this a little bit. Testing something on Earth alone in the moment is insufficient to draw conclusions about the broader cosmos and the past and in the future. But let's touch on that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I quote Robert Bennett, who's a physics PhD, and he talks about basically like we assume things were true in the past as they are today. But what if there's some malleability, and we assume that light sources we see from different places are producing the same kind of light? So the point is that we have to think that maybe things were different in the past than they are today, and rather than assuming this constancy.
Right.
And there's just so many variables that are often not considered. It's like we just jump to conclusions when we observe something and forget how many variables could be interfering.
Right. The seventh one is the way our eyes see obscures reality, and many of us are unaware of this issue. Thus, we failed to make the necessary mental adjustment.
So, like you said, we see a tiny percentage of the electromagnetic spectrum, or at least the spectrum that we know of.
Right.
So that means there's a lot of stuff that our eyes are not picking up all the time. But even beyond that, there's a notion called perspective, which architects and artists are very familiar with, but it seems like in cosmology and physics, people don't know as much about it. And this is very important because many of the observations are based on what we see, and we see things because of the way our eyes interpret them, but our eyes might be playing tricks on us or things we have to correct for. So consider, for example, if you're on a straight road where there are street lights, all the same height, it will look like the street lights in the distance are actually moving down as you get further away. They're lower and lower. They're approaching your eye level, but they're the same height. Think about that for a second. What does that mean about the things above us? Or the sun, we say the sun's setting, like moving down, or is it just moving away at the same height, but it looks like it's moving down because of perspective? These are things we have to consider. And we have to consider this with regard to the motion of all objects in the sky, the stars and so forth, that basically from your position, you're going to perceive things in a certain way. Visual perspective.
I remember learning that in art class too, that we would draw with a ruler a point on whatever piece of art we were using. Like, let's say we're making a drawing that was supposed to look like a 3D drawing. And there was a point in which in the distance on the drawing, everything vanished to that point. And that's what we're kind of talking about here, is that the way our eyes work is everything ultimately across a distance goes to a vanishing point.
Yes. And another example is railroad tracks. If you're at eye level, if your eye level is on the ground with the railroad tracks, even though they're parallel, it will look like they're diagonal and actually merging toward this vanishing point. So we have to correct for that when we're making any cosmological observations. So we end up seeing in curved visual space, as Austin Whitsitt describes it. He has a great video on what's known as the azimuthal grid of vision, where he explains that if you apply this visual perspective in terms of how we see things from a 360-degree basis, we end up having this dome of vision based on how we have. First of all, we can't see forever, and there's an attenuation of light. So when light moves through the atmosphere, like if you're shining a light in fog, for example, the light will be dimmer. We cannot see forever. And when you apply that, you end up with this dome of vision, including visual perspective, like the street lights moving down. So we end up seeing in what looks like curvature, but it's not spherical curvature. I was actually in the Netherlands recently. My Dutch publisher translated some of my books, so I was out there for a book tour, and it's super flat there. So driving, you get to feel this azimuthal grid of vision, the dome in all directions, and it feels like you're in a dome, but it's because of perspective. So it's circular in a sense, but not spherical.
I feel like the same effect happens, and that's why you say that these areas have like big sky in air quotes. In some parts of Arizona and Nevada as well. Like I've experienced that before, where it feels like I'm in some sort of dome.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you look at the clouds even,
yeah,
and it might look like the clouds are setting.
Yeah.
From some perspective,
for sure.
It's because of perspective.
Right.
As they're further and further away, it looks like they're approaching your eye level. And that's just the way that we perceive the world. So that means all astronomical observations, we have to rethink, what are we seeing? The stars in the sky. What's actually going on?
That's why I'm blessed that I grew up in Kansas, because I've driven across the state of Kansas so much, where you see just such a long stretch of I-70. And I-70, I mean, Kansas is so incredibly flat that you can see where the clouds are appearing to meet the road in the distance pretty easily. And I don't recommend anyone do that drive. It is like the worst drive ever, but it gives you perspective into what we're talking about here. Okay, so the eighth one, and I think this one is severely overlooked when it comes to how people frame their perspective of observed reality. And you write, math is a tool. It is not evidence that a model is correct. I see a lot of people in all areas, and I used to do this as well, appeal to mathematical modeling in order to assert that reality is a certain way. Why is that problematic?
Well, think about how many assumptions go into mathematical equations. How many of those assumptions are being examined as to whether or not they are true? So the assumptions need to be examined. And also, math can be made to fit certain situations. So math is a useful tool, but it's not necessarily proof without having everything examined first.
Right.
Like the presuppositions.
Right. Like you and I could sit here and do an experiment based, a study based in physics where, for example, we drop something or we throw an object a certain speed and then we can calculate the weight, we can calculate how fast we threw it and come up with something to describe math as a descriptive way to share how that all occurred, what we actually observed to happen. But likewise, math can be used to describe something that is totally theoretical, that has not been proven to be true, that is totally made up, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue with appealing to math as proof, is that it is a tool, or I like to say a language that can be used to describe something that is real or something that is totally unreal. And what we see a lot of, and I think that goes back to what we're talking about with dark matter and there's no unified theory in physics, is that a lot of that is predicated on mathematical modeling, some of which might have been observed in reality for which they applied math to, also with amalgamations of several things that they have not observed at all in reality, sort of layered upon it piece by piece.
Right. So if we wanted to be very precise with regard to any equation, we'd have to go back to the origin. Where was this established? What were the assumptions? And then how is it being applied? So the point is that math is not necessarily proof. It is a useful tool, but you can't just say that's the math works and therefore the model's correct.
That's
doesn't
why
always work that way.
Yeah, that's why I get so frustrated when people say math is the language of the universe. And I used to think the same thing, but now I know that that's simply not the case. Math is a tool to describe how both real things work and also can be used in order to put forth, fantasy ideas of how things might work. That's the issue with saying something like math is the language of the universe. That's not necessarily true. Math is a language, but to say it's the language of the universe is implying that it can accurately describe everything that we are witnessing.
And think about how many theoretical mathematical models have been created that led us down a very negative path. COVID, for example.
Right.
There are many questions about climate-related models. And we even see this in meteorology, like how often are they correctly predicting the temperature 2 weeks from now in any given location, or the weather patterns? There's so many variables, even with complex math.
Right.
And sometimes equations can be very sensitive to initial assumptions.
Right.
So the point is, if someone says the math proves it, we'd have to look many steps deeper to see all the variables involved, where the equations come from, what are the assumptions.
Perfect example of that is yesterday, there was no rain on the forecast at all. And then my wife and I got rained on.
How could that be if the math said
the model has to be correct?
Right. And granted, some models do give things probabilistically, but the point is we've seen it lead us astray before.
Yeah. All right. The ninth one you bring up in the book is beware of the appeal to personal incredulity, logical fallacy. Can you touch on that and why that's important?
Yeah, it's basically the idea that if I can't conceive it, it must not be possible. And there's so many things that are beyond what we can conceive of. Like Donald Rumsfeld talked about the unknown unknowns.
Right.
We have to keep that in mind.
What's that one quote that's like, it's not the things that you know that get you, it's the things you don't know that end up getting you, or something like that.
Yeah.
I think there's a quote like that.
It's a similar principle.
Yeah.
So we have to keep in mind that just because our limited perception might not be able to comprehend something, or we just say, let's say with regard to a conspiracy, I can't conceive of how this information could be concealed, therefore it's not possible.
Right.
That's not a logical approach.
Right. And this ties directly into affirming the consequent logical fallacy. It's pointing to effects as proof of cause is not proof of cause unless you falsify all the other possibilities that led to that cause or directly observe that thing causing the effect in question. Right. That's what it all ties back to.
But it requires mental energy, because we could come forth with a claim and someone who's not familiar with it says, well, I can't believe how that could be true. I'm just going to go on with my day. That's what happens very often.
Or I'm going to go back to this falsified model. That's what a lot of people do. Okay, so now that we've gone over those, where I would like to frame this conversation next, if it's okay with you, is going into all of the things, we've already discussed dark matter a little bit, that falsify the currently accepted heliocentric model. And again, I want to be clear before we proceed. I think Mark and I can let's hold each other accountable. If either of us makes an assertion or makes a positive claim, we'll have to say, how do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop you, you stop me if either of us do that at any point in this conversation. But the point is, and this is a maxim of law, the burden of proof lies on the individual bringing forth the positive claim. And again, we've already stressed this. We don't need to know what is to clearly know what isn't. Falsifying one paradigm does not mean we have to have a better replacement paradigm. Mark and I are fully okay with just sitting here and saying, I don't know. And of course, we can provide other possible explanations for any given thing. But I think for the sake of this, aside from maybe some examples we might want to get into, I want to largely not do that. I would rather just focus on falsifying the currently accepted model. So where I'd like to start, unless you have a better idea of where to start, is with Michelson-Morley, because I think this one is a really big deal that even a lot of people who are skeptical of the globe, let's say, sort of overlook the importance of. So let's start with Michelson-Morley, if we could.
So this was a very important study done in 1887, and it followed a study by Michelson in 1881. And the design of it's complex to get into without diagrams, but there are some really good explanations by Robertson Janis. He has a book called Geocentrism 101 and some interviews with the physicist I mentioned, Robert Bennett. But basically, the results of this 1887 experiment have been interpreted to suggest that the ether does not exist. And then the second part of it is, and Earth revolves around the sun. That second part is not often stated, even though in the title of the paper it talks about Earth's motion. So often people say the 1887 study, Michelson-Morley, disproves the ether, but it also presupposes that Earth moves. But there are alternative explanations of these studies. There's also one in 1871 by Airy, and it's known as Airy's failure, based on the presupposition that Earth moves. But if Earth does not move, then it would be Airy's success. And the same thing goes with Michelson-Morley. So they're basically, the way I look at it, generally speaking, is one interpretation, and this is which has led us to the current model of cosmology, is that the ether doesn't exist and Earth moves, or the ether exists and Earth does not move.
And because they presuppose prior to this study the idea that the Earth moves, they ended up going with, based on the results, the ether does not exist and the Earth moves. Ultimately, again, because they're like, oh, we already know the Earth moves, so because these results are indicating X, it must mean that the ether doesn't exist and the Earth moves.
Yes, exactly. But there are 2 points I want to make. People often talk about a null result in these experiments, which prove that the ether doesn't exist. But there are physicists like Robert Bennett who say there was actually a fringe shift detected. So the results have been interpreted by him and some others to say that ether, which in historical times was the fifth element.
Yeah.
And so they basically took that out of physics, but he's saying, wait, Bennett and others are saying that this ether does exist, but Earth is stationary. The second point I want to make is that there are a number of physicists who talk about these results of the Michelson-Morley study. So I quote a few in the book, but I'll mention a few here because this is really important. Physicist Henri Poincaré wrote in his 1901 book, Science and Hypotheses, quote, "A great deal of research has been carried out concerning the influence of Earth's movement on these studies. The results were always negative." He commented in 1905, "Are we about to enter now upon the eve of a second crisis? These principles on which we have built all, are they about to crumble away in their turn? Alas, such are the indubitable results of the experiments of Michelson." And I could go on, where there are many physicists who are basically saying, here's another one. The failure of the many attempts to measure terrestrially any effects of the Earth's motion. That was Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. We could go on. So that it's not a slam dunk in the way that many people say, that the ether has been thrown out and that Earth is moving. So we ended up with Einstein's relativity following the 1887 experiment. And some people have disputed whether Einstein was actually influenced by the study. And in my book, I quote Einstein. He says he was influenced by it. And relativity theory, as it's been interpreted by those who question mainstream cosmology, is that relativity talks about the basically shrinking of things, of the bending and warping of space-time, depending on how fast things are moving. So you could actually, like the movie Interstellar, I used to reference this all the time, where like someone's traveling at this, like light speed and then ages less quickly. You age less quickly as you're moving fast.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing goes for objects. They can actually contract.
Mm-hmm.
Time dilation and space contraction. And so what Einstein's finding was that in the Michelson studies, the measuring device somehow was shrinking, and that led to the results they found. So this is potentially a post hoc rationalization.
Yes.
That's one way people have been talking about it. So the point is an entire new physics was created after these studies in the 1800s to preserve Earth's motion and to get rid of the ether. What if there's another physics in which the ether does exist and Earth is stationary?
Right. And what we're kind of hitting at here is that if you did not have the preconceived idea heading into this study that the Earth was moving, I would think that, and maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong on this, most people would conclude that, okay, ether exists and the Earth is not moving.
Right.
Based on the results of the study.
But the paper itself, the Michelson-Morley paper, was titled On the Relative Motion of the Earth and the Luminiferous Ether. So it presupposes relative motion of the Earth.
Right.
There's a deeply ingrained belief system, and you can kind of understand it. If something is that, it's like virology. It's like, who would go to think that maybe we got that wrong?
Right. And then when the results were indicating otherwise, that the Earth was indeed not moving, that's when they had to come up with these rescue devices, this post hoc rationalization, that there was a dilation in the instruments that ultimately led to that, which then you could argue might have bred the whole theory of relativity.
That's the counter narrative that's put forth right now, is that the measuring device somehow shrunk, and that's what explained the observations, and we can preserve the idea that Earth moves and there is no ether, and we're going to build an entire physics on it. And I should mention Robert Bennett, who I quote, and there are a number of interviews he's done, especially with Austin Whitsitt. If your audience is interested, check those out.
Yeah.
He's like a serious physicist who goes through all the details of how these experiments are conducted. But he comes from an Einstein lineage of his advisor, I believe, was mentored by someone who worked directly with Einstein, and Bennett wrote his thesis on relativity. So this isn't just like some random thing, that there are, let's just say, credible people talking about an alternative way of explaining results from the 1800s. And if you it's like taking two different turns on a hike or two different paths. You take one path that leads us down the current cosmology of relativity and a Big Bang and heliocentrism, whereas the other one, if you bring back the ether, that could introduce many new areas of physics and technology, like free energy and who knows what else, but also cosmology.
Dude, I've said before on this podcast and a number of episodes, especially on the more esoteric sort of spiritual, how does reality work episodes, that a lot of the so-called psychic phenomena, I think, can be more adequately described if you bring ether back into the picture, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've had to reconsider so many things myself because I've written about psychic phenomena before considering ether. And now ether, to me, might be a spiritual interface. The interface between the spiritual, whatever that is, consciousness, and the apparently physical realm, whatever physical is. And it's the interface. Somehow reality can be molded into many different things using this ether as the intermediary.
Yeah. And he didn't make a claim there. He said
as a hypothesis.
Maybe. Right. He said maybe. The other thing I want to touch on with that, and then I want to move on to a little bit more maybe in ether cosmology, just some of the ideas that are put forth, and then go back to some of the things that falsify the currently accepted model, is, correct me if I'm wrong on this, after the Michelson-Morley experiments and after the theory of relativity was sort of really put forth, Einstein was quoted as saying something about, we may need to reconsider adding ether back in, or something to that effect. Am I incorrect in saying that?
Yeah. So this is, I believe it's in one of my endnotes in the book, that they're I'm trying to remember. There are some incompatibilities of relativity theory, of the special and general relativity theory. And one is with regard to light, that they treat light differently. And this is why Robert Bennett says these are incompatible. They can't work. And the other is the treatment of ether, that Einstein did talk about ether under one of his two theories, but he talked about it as a stationary ether rather than ether that moves.
Mm-hmm.
And the ether that moves is the one that we're talking about.
Got
So
it.
he did contemplate the notion of ether in his theories, but we're talking about a different version of it.
Okay.
And I hope I'm paraphrasing this. Again, this is not speaking as a physicist. This is speaking in general terms, but I do reference some resources in the book to go deeper on that.
Okay. Yeah. So read Mark's book. Okay. So let's talk about ether cosmology just a little bit, because Austin Whitsitt is one of the big proponents of that possible way to describe some of these things in reality. So can you touch on what you cover in the book related to ether cosmology?
Yeah. I found it super interesting, so I thought it was worth mentioning. And there's a lot of momentum in terms of talking about how we can bring together many areas of physics into a comprehensive cosmology of Earth that accommodates many of the anomalies with regard to the globe model. So it's the notion that Earth is a stationary topographical plane. Some would call that flat Earth, but the term flat is really not descriptive because topographical means there are peaks and valleys.
Right.
But it's a plane, basically, that serves, the technical term is that it's a block domain wall. It's like this inertial plane that is in the middle of a toroidal field. And to me, when I heard that, that was super interesting, because the torus seems to be an important area of physics and just so many, and the way forward, it's important everywhere. And so the idea is that the center point of the toroidal field is the center of the plane of at least what Earth is. There might be something beyond Earth in that framework, but that the toroidal field goes through what many consider to be the North Pole, the center of this
Magnetic north.
the magnetic north.
Mm-hmm.
And that the cosmology of what we see above us also could be accommodated by this as well.
Okay.
Robert Bennett talks about like an ether drift in the Aries experiment. So like that the ether is affecting the way that we are perceiving things as well. So I actually don't know how it all fits together mathematically, but it's the idea of a toroidal field surrounding the plane of Earth as something that could be tested, or at least explored.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about it like that, because in that context, it might, if you bring into consideration the toroidal field surrounding it, you could still possibly say that it is a globe, just a globe in a different way.
And I've seen people draw that out.
Yeah.
The toroidal field in a globe.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about ether cosmology, it's typically associated with a plane.
No, I know. No. I'm saying if you take into account the torus piece of it.
Oh, it looks like,
Yeah. It could still look like a globe. That's what I'm talking about. Just the toroidal field surrounding some sort of plane. The toroidal field, that itself is more spherical looking, is what I'm saying.
Yes, it does look like a sphere, or like two spheres, basically, because that's to go through the middle.
Yeah, exactly.
And the question is, what is that toroidal field? Is it something physical? Could we perceive it with a different set of perceptual organs? And that gets into lots of questions about what we observe.
A lot of people who claim to be able to see, and again, I've never validated them myself, auras, like people's auras are biofields, for example. Like if someone's be able to perceive that on the Earth, possibly. Yeah. Okay. Back to falsification. So this is a big one, is falsification of curvature. And in your book, you highlight countless examples of falsifying the accepted mainstream radius of the Earth. And again, I want to emphasize what Mark brought up earlier regarding black swans falsifying a model. If you find even one anomaly in a currently accepted model, then you need to rethink the entire model, rethink the entire premise. And that's the whole point here. So the falsification of curvature, what did you uncover in your book?
And this one seems like an easy thing for many people to test, that if Earth is what the conventional model says, it has a radius value of roughly 4,000 miles at the equator. And also the model says that Earth is not a perfect sphere. It's an oblate spheroid, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, colloquially pear-shaped, but basically a sphere with that radius value. Then there should be objects that are not visible from certain points because they're literally blocked by the physical Earth. They're below the curve. It would be like if you're looking around a bend, you can't see things that are around the bend because it's literally blocked.
What's up, you guys? I'm here with Matt Maruca, the founder of Raw Optics, to talk about something that I would say the overwhelming majority of people in the holistic health community totally overlook light and circadian rhythm health.
All of our cells contain these organelles called mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. They make energy, they convert food into useful chemical energy. And it turns out mitochondria are largely controlled by our circadian rhythm. Our mitochondria are more active during the day under the influence of sunlight. When the sun goes away, our mitochondria have the opportunity to rest, repair, and regenerate when we're not being active. When it gets dark, the brain releases melatonin, and melatonin goes in and actually repairs the mitochondria, repairs all the oxidative damage that happens. Now, if we're exposed to blue light from all the artificial light sources, your phone, your iPad, your computer, your TV, the lead scientist we work with, Dr. Alexander Wunsch from Germany, actually calls it light doping. So people today are sort of being light doped by their employers with artificial blue enriched lighting to increase their productivity at the expense of their health, mental health, and long-term health and well-being. And so just by being exposed to artificial light at night can actually have a massive effect on the body's rhythm, cellular repair, and overall health and function. So we designed lenses that specifically block these disruptive wavelengths of light. So that's why we created daylight lenses. They protect your eyes from the physical damage of short wavelength blue light, but also offer a bit of a protective and relaxing effect for your hormonal system as well, but not to the degree of the sunset lenses, which are designed to basically make you really tired and even kind of knock you out in the evening. So these are the two lenses we offer so that you can have protection at the right levels, in the right way, at the right time. And then sunset lenses, you wear these 2-3 hours before bed or just from the sunset until sleep so that your brain can register, okay, the sunset, it's time for me to release that melatonin naturally so I can wind down and not have to use alcohol, weed, sleeping pills, and other things that so many people unfortunately have become dependent on because we're constantly disrupting our body's release of its natural sleep hormone.
So if you want to take control of your light and optimize your biology, head to the show notes or go to rawoptics.com and use code TWF10 at checkout for 10% off. On that point, real quick, with respect to the pear-shaped claim, or the oblate spheroid claim, that would imply that there are only certain parts of the Earth where you could falsify the radius, or that the radius is different in various parts of the Earth. But even if that were the case, correct me if I'm wrong, people have falsified the radius all over the Earth, meaning irrespective of whether it's on the part that is allegedly more pear-shaped or the part that is allegedly more round, people are falsifying the accepted radius value all over the Earth.
Yeah, that's a good point. That you'd have to do the math appropriately. What's the radius value? What should be blocked, basically?
Right.
And it also has to do with the person's altitude.
Mm-hmm.
So that the point is that many people have done this at different parts of the Earth, and they see things that they shouldn't be able to see, and then it's there.
Right.
So how is that explained? Now, I do think there need to be many replications of this sort of thing because there are just issues with the atmosphere and who knows what else.
Yeah.
But if people really wanted to get rid of quote unquote flat Earth believers, I mean, you would expect the agencies to go out there and say, here's all the math, here's our telescope, this thing should be blocked by Earth, we're going to show you what we see in the telescope and get a bunch of people to do it together. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen that. Maybe it's been done, but I've seen the reverse, is that people are like, I was a globe skeptic. I was a skeptic of people who said flat Earth. So I went out and I did the math and I was able to see something that should have been blocked by curvature.
Yeah, you see countless examples of that. People who believed in the globe and heard these so-called flat Earth claims, and they're like, I'm going to go test this myself. And then when they tested it themselves, or they were able to see things well beyond what they should have been able to see based on the accepted radius value of the Earth.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are many examples, and the ones that I cite were cited in a court case. It was won by Zen Garcia. He won a case in 2019. He said he would grant $5,000 to anyone who could show real world proof of Earth's curvature or motion with two experiments. And someone submitted something saying that it was proof, and there was a disagreement. They brought it to a court, and Zen Garcia won the case, which is interesting. Doesn't prove anything, but it was interesting finding. But I liked the examples that he cited because those were things that a judge looked at. Yeah. And there were a number of them that he cited. One was the most famous case, which is the Chicago skyline. And that's probably been analyzed the most. Part of me doesn't want to harp on it too much because there are so many other ones that would have
Right.
to be. Some people claim they've debunked the flat earthers who've gone out and looked at it, but there are many other examples.
Right.
People saw things that should have been blocked by a lot of curvature, and they continue to do so. And Austin and others have said, like, the reason this movement is growing, globe skepticism, is because they're going out themselves and looking, and they're seeing things. What's going on with that?
Right.
So I mentioned in the book, because it's good evidence, I think, or it's an important area to research, and also hopefully to encourage other people to look at this, and maybe even the agencies to. This is a very simple thing. Like,
It is.
you should see it. You can see it or you can't, and you should or you shouldn't be able to see it. Let's look at a lot of examples of that.
Yeah, exactly. Can you touch on that one though with the Chicago skyline? I know you don't want to harp on it too much, but it is important because there's a news clip that I think you also bring up in your book, if I remember correctly, where someone is viewing the Chicago skyline well beyond what they should be able to, and then the news anchors are saying something to the effect of, oh, the reason they're able to see the Chicago skyline is because it's actually a mirage due to refraction that happens, light bends, and this is bending around the curvature of the earth, and ultimately that's why you can see beyond what you should be able to see. But in this case with the Chicago skyline, these guys, Rob Skiba and Rick Hummer, they had their cameras set on the skyline, and then they approached on a boat while keeping their cameras laid on the skyline the entire time, showing that it never switched from a, quote, mirage to the actual buildings. And the whole time they were actually just able to see the buildings, which were well beyond what they should be able to see based on the accepted curvature. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of that.
So I'm going to read this to you.
Yeah.
So there was an ABC 57 local news report in 2015, South Bend, Indiana. The article was titled "Mirage of Chicago Skyline Seen from Michigan Shoreline." Of course, so presupposing mirage. And this notion of refraction is a post hoc rationalization, potentially in many cases.
Right.
Where we can't, this is not possible on a globe model. Therefore, there must be something that we can put in to preserve the globe model.
Right.
And the bending of light, meaning what you see with your eyes is actually not there. That's what they're saying. It's
Right.
an illusion because light's bending.
Right.
This is important because we're going to see it later with the Selenelian lunar eclipse, which is important, but we'll flag that for later. Okay, this is what the article says. A picture from the Chicago skyline taken almost 60 miles away is actually a mirage. Photographer Joshua Nowicki snapped the pic Tuesday night from Grand Mere State Park in Stevensville. Under normal conditions, even when extremely clear, this should not be visible due to the curvature of Earth, presupposing curvature. The Chicago skyline is physically below the horizon from that vantage point, but the image of the skyline can be seen above it. This is what Zen Garcia remarked in his court documents. This is the 2019 court case that he won. The news report was proven false by two of my colleagues, Rob Skiba and Rick Hummer. These gentlemen went to Chicago and made a video documentary confirming that one can see the picturesque Chicago cityscape from the side of Lake Michigan where Joshua took his picture. They then rowed across Lake Michigan in a boat while filming the entire duration, the city growing in scope and size as one came nearer to it. This documentary affirmed without a doubt that one could in fact see the Chicago skyline from such distance, and that it was not, as the news weatherman claimed, a mirage.
It's a big deal. I'm trying to find in your book where you say, because I know you say in there how far below the curve the skyline should be, just to like really hit this point home, because it should be well below.
It might have been for some other examples.
Okay. It might have been some of the other examples.
Yes,
Yeah,
of seeing things that they shouldn't be able to see. Because there are some that should have been miles below.
Give some more examples, because I'm going to
some
find the ones that should have been miles below. Oh, here we go. I think I found it.
Well, this is a good one too.
Okay.
As you're looking for that,
Yeah.
This was presented by Austin Whitsitt, where he's looking at oil rigs in the distance from the beach, taken at a height of about 1.5 feet off the ground. The horizon should be under 2 miles from the camera at its height, given what the Earth's radius value should be. The farthest oil rig is about 10 miles away, and the horizon can be seen behind it. Think about that. Wait, if the horizon should be under 2 miles from the camera, and you know the oil rig's 10 miles, and you can see the oil rig what does that mean about the horizon and the curvature?
Right.
The farthest oil rig is about 10 miles away.
But that's a like really important point I want to stress here too, though, is not only can you see the oil rigs, you can see the horizon beyond the oil rigs. If you guys missed what Mark's saying there, you shouldn't be able to see the oil rig first off, but you shouldn't be able to see well beyond the oil rig. And this also indicates that it's not just merely a quote refraction that is causing this phenomenon. It's that you can see the oil rig and everything beyond it.
Yeah, I'm going to quote Austin. I quoted my book. He says it really well. It's basic geometry. The horizon in the globe model has to be in front of the oil rigs. There's no magical invocation of refraction that globe Earth believers can point to. This right here refutes the globe. This is why flat earthers exist. They went and looked at the Earth.
Boom. That's it. It's it right there.
It's something that needs to be looked at more and more.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Right.
I get more and more lately, I'm getting frustrated when people refer to us, and I understand the colloquialism of like calling us flat earthers in order to describe the type of people who question the globe. But again, that implies that all of us who are skeptics of the globe claims are making the assertion that it is flat, that it is one way. And again, to emphasize, Mark and I here, many others who are colloquially known as flat earthers, are not saying that the earth is this. We're saying you have no evidence that the earth is what you claim that it is, or the evidence that you put forth, we can falsify in a number of ways, which is what we're doing right here.
Yeah. And I love the term globe skeptic. It's one that I use throughout the book. I feel much more comfortable with that.
Same.
Because I don't know what it is. I think there are some observations that do fit the flat framework.
Like like what we experience right now. We experience a stationary flat plane. That's what we experience.
Yeah.
But again, you and I both know, I think this goes without saying, that doesn't mean our direct experience is invariably 100% accurate and true.
Right.
Right.
But we've never, at least I've never seen the down and away curvature that you're supposed to see.
Right.
I've seen circular curvature.
Yeah.
That's very different than down and away spherical curvature that you're supposed to see. I haven't seen what would be direct evidence of a spinning globe, which is a video footage of the full sphere of Earth doing a full rotation. That footage doesn't exist. We've seen bits and pieces from satellites where it looks like there might be some curvature and you have to extrapolate. That's a full sphere.
Right.
So this is globe skepticism versus a flat Earth belief. Very important. And I found that people, because the book's only been out for a few months, they can almost exhale. They're like, well, I actually think I might be a globe skeptic.
And that's okay.
That's okay, because I'm skeptical of mainstream cosmology. There's too many holes in it, but I don't know if I can go full flat Earth because there might be holes in that too.
Totally.
And they're like, that's cool. So hopefully if your audience is listening right now, that's what we're talking about, is the current model cannot accommodate so many things that we've already talked about. And it's okay to be skeptical. And it's actually something that made me intrigued as I was researching, like, why is there such a stigma about these beliefs? This is pretty harmless. Like in medicine, I can understand it with virology. If you actually believe in contagion fully, that there are these lethal things that no one's ever established using the scientific method, then
that could be what happened over the last 4.5 years, of course.
Then that could be quote unquote dangerous. That's different than this. What is the danger in believing something about where you live? And that makes me wonder if there's something in this about the concealment of the true cosmology.
Right. And people are up in arms more about this than they are the other topics by far, in my experience. By far.
Yeah. People are more inclined to say, you lost me with this. I mean, virology is a pretty big one too, but this is next level.
This is next level. It didn't end with you writing an end to Upside Down Liberty and saying statism might not be the way.
No, that was a big one too. But each one, it's like I don't know, something's pushing me to go further and further.
Right. Okay, so I want to just read one of these examples, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
One of the examples of seeing too far in your book. The longest line of sight observations in the Guinness Book of World Records is 275 miles, taken in 2019 by Gaspard Picard in Malmort, France. I think I pronounced that right. Line of sight refers to observations that are directly from the observer's eye to the object that's viewed without any obstructions. In this example, the observer views mountains from an altitude of 9,251 feet, roughly 1.7 miles. The mountain should be more than 3 miles below Earth's curve, but they are visible. Think about that, 3 miles below Earth's curve. And you go into countless examples.
Yeah, I want to give one more, and these were listed by Austin Whitsitt in one of his lectures. Mountains 255 miles away from an observer at a height of 9,824 feet are seen, even though there should be 12,800 feet, more than 2 miles of curvature blocking the view of the mountains. In other words, they should be far below the curve, and yet they are visible. This is the key. The image is taken using infrared, which is significant because infrared mitigates the effect of refraction of light. So there's some interesting ways to test this. And there's another one that Austin references, I think it's the Canigou Mountain, where the sun sets behind it, effectively backlighting it so the mountain is clearly visible from long distances. And so the globe advocate's standard rebuttal is that refraction makes the mountain visible. However, because the sun is behind the mountain, what is seen is a silhouette. And what Austin Whitsitt alleges is that this is a shadow, which is the absence of light. And since refraction is the bending of light, refraction should not explain this observation. That's interesting too.
Very interesting.
So another meta point I want to make, because if your audience is new to this topic, the people who have looked at globe skepticism have done a ton of work, whether they're right or not. This is not just, I don't believe anything, NASA's fake, everything's fake.
Right.
This is like serious evaluation of physics from the 1800s to photographic evidence. And that was something that surprised me.
Right. So the point is there are countless examples of falsifying the alleged curvature and the radius value of the Earth. And again, irrespective of whether it's a part that is supposed to be more pear-shaped versus the part that's supposed to be more round, people have falsified the curvature and the radius value all over the Earth. So it doesn't matter whether it's in that specific area that is more pear, more round, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't really matter. They're doing it all over the place.
Yeah, there's geometry and it can be calculated.
Exactly.
Pretty simple.
Yep. The other thing that I want to get into related to that, the horizon rises to eye level, especially as it relates to people going up in things like hot air balloons or like the high altitude examples of Russian, I forget what line of work they were in, but essentially people who are sent up in very high altitudes in Russia for various reasons and not seeing more of the horizon.
Yeah. So the notion of a horizon in the globe model, it's a physical thing because the Earth is curving. It's a sphere.
Right.
So there's a point at which you won't see things like ships are supposed to go over the horizon,
right?
Allegedly, even though there are ways to
There's
explain
a backstop to what you can see because it's ultimately the Earth curve. The Earth itself is the backstop, essentially.
Yes.
Right.
And as you elevate, you would expect, as you get higher and higher, you'll see that down and away curvature from higher altitudes. But when people started going up in hot air balloons, they were not seeing that. So I'll give this is from 1931, scientist Auguste Piccard. He went to an altitude of 51,775 feet, almost 10 miles in a hydrogen balloon. And this was written in Popular Science. He said what he observed, it seemed a flat disc with an upturned edge.
Interesting.
You would have expected it down and away.
Right.
And so what's going on with that? And then in 1933, the USSR broke his record. They launched a balloon to an altitude of 60,095 feet. Popular Science magazine wrote about this one, quote, soaring in their airtight balloon gondola to a record-breaking height of 11.8 miles above the Earth. The other day, 3 Russian aeronauts brought back the first scientific observations ever made at so great an altitude. Above their heads, the sky provided a striking spectacle. Its color had turned a soft, deep violet and almost devoid of the light-reflecting haze found at lower levels. Looking down, they tried in vain to detect any curvature of the Earth's horizon.
Mm-hmm. And were they at a point, based on the commonly accepted mainstream size of the Earth, curvature of the Earth, at a point where they should have been able to see some sort of curvature in these examples?
I believe they should have seen some.
Yeah.
And the idea is that as you're elevating,
you should be able to see more of the horizon anyway.
Right.
Exactly.
But instead it's rising to eye level.
Right. Right.
So you can do this on a plane. You can do the exercise on a plane. The horizon rises to eye level. And this is one of the complaints. Steve Young talks about this in his book, A Fool's Wisdom, with like some of the footage we see of rockets, that the footage will cut out. You'd want to see continuous footage as something is ascending higher and higher, especially at the highest altitudes where the down and away curvature would be clear using the radius value math. And we don't have that visual evidence to many people's satisfaction.
Right. Okay. The other one is ships vanishing hull first doesn't necessarily mean that it's a globe.
Yeah, it has to do with the viewing angle.
Mhm.
And I've seen a video, Dave White posted this, and I've tried it myself, where basically if you put your eyes at the level of your kitchen counter, for example, and someone's holding a nickel right in front of your eyes and pulls the nickel farther and farther away from your eyes, what happens is the bottom of the nickel, all of a sudden it becomes not visible to your eyes because you're so close to the kitchen counter, and then eventually it disappears. So I would just recommend to your audience to do that exercise and then think about things that you observe that disappear,
Right.
whether it's the sun or anything else. So it has to do with the angular resolution. And there are different areas of optics and physics that get into the details of this. But there are explanations other than a globe. Can the globe explain it? Yes.
Mhm.
The globe can explain why a ship will disappear. Aristotle referred to this long ago. But that doesn't mean the globe's correct. There might be other reasons.
Right.
It also doesn't mean that the Earth is flat up to that point, because the flat model can explain it.
Right.
And another point I should make is some people say, well, maybe we can see objects that are far away, going back to the previous point, and Earth is still a sphere. It just has a much bigger radius. That's great. That's possible. But what does that mean for all of physics? Because physics is based on gravity, and gravity is based on mass. So the radius of Earth would, if it's much bigger, Earth would have a much bigger mass. And then how does that relate to the moon's distance and the sun's distance? It would destroy so much of cosmology, day-night cycles, everything. So maybe Earth is a bigger sphere, but that still means that mainstream cosmology's got problems.
Right. Major problems. It pokes holes in the entire thing. Basically, it falsifies the entire thing. Yeah, the entire accepted model, and that's the whole point. The other thing with ships vanishing hull first, and this goes back to what we had already discussed before, is it's all about perspective as well. Everything goes towards sort of a vanishing point across the horizon. The other thing that I wanted to cover is the Guglielmo Marconi. I think I pronounced that right. Is it Guglielmo Marconi, Marconi? Horizontal wave propagation of 2,200 miles, because this is what led to what I would consider to be a rescue device, the ionosphere, but that may not be the case. But ultimately, Austin Whitsitt shares, as you share in the book, an example of higher frequency waves should still be able to penetrate the ionosphere. Explain the whole thing. Let's
it's
start with
basically
the
when you
foundation.
send out waves, they go horizontally and you want to send it from one person to another. That's okay over relatively short distances on a globe.
Yep.
But if it's long distance on a globe, then your horizontal waves will fly out into space.
Right.
They're not going to hug the curve. And this was 1901. So when Marconi sent the radio waves out, and he sent them successfully 2,200 miles. And some people at the time were skeptical that he'd be able to do it, but he was able to send it. Even though the transmission at around 200 miles should have blocked it.
Right.
Or
it should have went
flown
off
out
into
space.
Exactly.
So think about it.
So what we're
sending
talking about
waves.
here is radio waves, line of sight, go over a certain distance, and then based on the accepted curvature of the Earth, at some point, because the Earth curves away, the radio waves should just blast out into space, tangentially, essentially. But the problem is, he was able to make radio waves propagate 2,200. I don't know if were they radio waves? Yeah. High frequency radio waves. Were able to be accepted 2,200 miles away, which should not be possible based on the accepted radius value and curvature of the Earth.
Yes, those waves should have flown off into space before reaching the person way down below the curve.
Right. And what they said was the ionosphere is what explains that.
The waves are reflected off the ionosphere.
Right.
So that there's something in the atmosphere and then it goes down perfectly. You have to draw out the geometry to the person on the other part of the ball.
Right.
So that the ionosphere, you could argue, was a post hoc rationalization. It was invented to accommodate this observation.
You think the ionosphere has a bunch of invisible little guys who just accept the radio waves and then are able to direct them directly to the person that they're supposed to go to?
Yeah, it's like sports. You throw the ball to them, they throw the ball down.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is
that's the current claim.
Yeah, exactly.
But so researchers like Austin Whitsitt have said that that's fine, except the ionosphere is only supposed to accept is only supposed to reflect waves of a certain frequency, but higher frequency waves should go through the ionosphere.
That's what they claim, right?
That's the mainstream scientific claim.
Right.
And what Austin has compiled is examples where higher frequencies reach the person and they should be going off into space.
Right. So essentially the ionosphere is only able to reflect waves of a certain frequency, which is what they claim is the reason that waves are propagating well over 200 miles.
Mhm.
But there are examples of things that are higher frequencies, which, according to mainstream scientific community's claims, should not be reflected back by the ionosphere, are ultimately being, quote, reflected back by the ionosphere in this case, or not that, but are ultimately reaching people far beyond what they should be able to be reaching, essentially. Right.
So he's citing examples in which radio waves with these higher frequencies successfully reached recipients more than 2,000 miles away. So they shouldn't have reflected off this alleged ionosphere, but somehow the waves reached the person below the horizon.
Right.
So that's a big anomaly. What's another explanation? That those 2,000 miles are a plane.
Right.
That's one model that could accommodate it.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. But nonetheless, their claims are falsified here.
Their claims it doesn't work,
right.
seemingly.
Right.
So again, this is something that's like, this should be examined.
Mm-hmm.
Why does this occur? And now there's an entire, I don't even know what you call it, atmospheric science based on what might be post hoc rationalizations.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I would love to look at more deeply. Like, what are these different layers of the atmosphere? What if that is shown to be valid, and what is just trying to preserve the globe model?
Right. The other one you bring up in the book that falsifies the accepted model is specular reflection.
Can I mention one more thing just really quickly?
Yeah,
because I know this affected, this has had a big effect on some people, is that if we use this horizontal wave propagation example, you can't use the same explanations with like refraction or things bumping off of an ionosphere in the water. And whales have sonar communication, and they're able to communicate up to 10,000 miles from each other.
Yeah.
So they're propagating these waves and they are communicating. And what scientists say is that there's a channel in the water that bends around the globe so the whales can communicate, rather than the sonar waves from one whale flying off the earth. They are able to reach other whales.
10,000 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So what they're claiming in order to rescue the falsification of the Earth radius and curvature here is the idea that, this must be explained by a channel in the water that these waves travel through and hug the curvature of the Earth in order to reach whales 10,000 miles away.
Right.
Yeah.
So the argument that we might make here is that there's a post hoc rationalization, that this channel does not exist in the way that scientists say it should exist. But we know these whales can communicate. Think about it.
Yeah. Across 10,000 miles. Okay, now specular reflection.
Yeah, so the specular reflection is a mirror-like reflection, where if you have very still water, which poses its own questions about water that's really, really still in a huge lake, if we're moving in the way that we're told we're moving, which is moving faster than the speed of sound, 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, rotating on an axis with 4 different wobbles, moving around the sun at over 60,000 miles an hour, while moving around the Milky Way galaxy at over 500,000 miles an hour, while part of an expanding universe at over 1 million miles an hour outward into who knows what. And we feel none of that for reasons that scientists explain to us, that we don't feel any of that motion. There is complete stillness, to the point that you can have a mirror-like reflection of the mountains in the sky. This is also significant in terms of curvature, because if there were curvature, you would have a distorted reflection. And we see this in like fun houses, where there are weird distortions where the mirrors are curved and you look all funny. We don't see that. We can see specular reflections over great distances. Another one to think about. Really still water, and is giving a perfect reflection, basically,
right,
over large areas.
And that's why you bring up the funhouse example, because if there is curvature, you would expect that the reflection of, let's say, a mountain range right next to a lake would have some major distortions in the reflection. But what you see in countless photographic examples taken by professional photographers and amateur photographers is that the reflection of said mountain range or other natural object is perfectly identical and symmetrical to what is existing in reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we get a specular, a mirror-like reflection instead of a diffused or distorted reflection.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one is magnetic declination. That's what I want to cover next.
Yeah. This was a big one for me, and it still remains like, I don't know what to make of this. Basically, we don't understand Earth's magnetic field at all. And the beliefs we have about it are based on complete inference.
Yeah.
So the mainstream belief is that the magnetic field of Earth comes from the core, which is at the center of the sphere. The problem is no one's ever been there. So the digging expedition that's gone the furthest down that anyone's ever gone is under 8 miles. And the radius value is roughly 4,000 miles to get to the core. So we don't really know what's going on. And this is one of the problems with coming up with a model of Earth, because we'd want to be able to dig down really far. We've only been able to go down 8 miles. If we wanted to prove the globe, for example, and if we had the technology to be able to withstand whatever heat is alleged to be there, it would be great to dig all the way down past the core and then end out on the other side of space on the ball. Like that hasn't been done. That would be a great experiment to run, but it hasn't been done. Under 8 miles, not 4,000 miles. So what's happening way below is a big inference. In spite of those inferences, we're told the center of the core is really, really hot. It's actually too hot to produce a magnetic field because it exceeds what's known as the Curie point. But the outer core, due to its spinning and Earth's tilt or something like that, creates Earth's magnetic field through the geodynamo theory. Another problem is that the geodynamo theory has never been established or replicated as an effect. And I quote the University of Maryland, a lab that's talking about trying to do some experiments, and I'm paraphrasing, but they say something to the effect of, like, this has never been done, and we're not sure if we're going to be able to create this effect. So it's very highly theoretical how Earth's magnetic field is generated. And this results in a lot of weird things. So on the globe model, the Earth's geographic north and south poles are physical locations that you can point to, whereas the magnetic north and south poles differ, and they move around. And they move around a lot in the south in particular. The deviation's even greater in the south. So something's going on with that. And also, navigation is affected by our beliefs about Earth's magnetic field, where people actually have to adjust their compass readings to get to the right geographic location.
Interesting.
And there's something known as magnetic declination, which describes this difference between the geographic poles and the magnetic poles. There's a website, it's called magnetic-declination.com, and you can click on any point on Earth and it will show you the amount of adjustment that's needed.
I've had to do that with land navigation in the Army a number of times.
There are these declination charts.
Right.
This is how much you adjust your compass. So let's just take a step back. Our compasses do not work unless you manually adjust them.
Yeah, that's wild.
Based on a theory that's never been established, based on a place that's never been established either, the core of Earth. So when I hear people talking about this like impending pole shift, I'm just wondering now, like, do we have to reevaluate that? Is this pole shift just based on the faulty beliefs about Earth's magnetic field and all the adjustments that need to be made? I don't really know what's going on there. But what's interesting is that the amount of adjustment that needs to be made to the compasses goes completely haywire in Antarctica.
That's interesting.
To the degree of sometimes the declination is like negative 170 plus degrees. I quote some of them in my book just by clicking on like literal longitude, latitude points, meaning if your compass says something, turn around and then you'll get to the right geographic place.
Wow.
And then it'll be like 60 degrees declination and not far apart from each other. And so those who have subscribed more to a flat plane framework, they would say that the reason for this is that what we call Antarctica in the globe model, which is an island at the bottom of the ball, is actually not that. It actually represents like a wall around a circle. And if you were to create a sphere from that circle, you'd have to compress all the stuff on the circumference and bring it to one place at the bottom. And therefore you'd have crazy adjustments if you're talking about geographic locate. So that, I don't know what to make with that.
Yeah.
And something that like Austin Whitsitt has pointed this out is that at the equator, which is where the two maps, again, I'm not saying there's any correct map because we haven't been able to, let me make this point here. The reasons we can't have a comprehensive map of Earth, number one is we haven't been able to dig down far enough to know what's there. Number two, we don't have enough observations from above.
Right.
We only have space agencies and maybe a few other private, but we need to be really, really high. It would be great to see the full footage of Earth, and there are problems with NASA we can talk about.
Right.
Basically, we don't have an ability to independently validate things from above us. And then within Earth, we haven't been able to freely and privately explore many places, including the North Pole area, because there's some restrictions, but also Antarctica. Even though people can travel there, it's like saying, well, I know all about North America because I went to San Francisco. We need to have like full mapping of this stuff. And there are a lot of mysteries. There's a 1959 Antarctic Treaty, which was signed by arch nemeses, the US and Soviets and many other countries.
Which is so interesting.
Some weird things there.
Right.
So because of that, we cannot create a comprehensive model of Earth. Let me repeat that. Like, we cannot right now do that.
Right. So even on the sort of quote flat Earth side, when people appeal to the Gleason map or to these other maps of the Earth and claim that is the true map, that's also a claim that is not proven.
Yes. And there are many people who would subscribe more to a flat Earth type framework who would say that the Gleason map, which anyone can Google, is not precise.
Right.
So the point is, we don't know what the precise map is. And where I was going with this is that if you took a general flat map, which again are Antarctica around the circle, the North Pole is at the center, the geographic North Pole, which is also the magnetic North Pole and the flat framework. The equator, which is a circle, basically it's a circle in the middle of that in a flat map. The amount of declination at the equator of the sphere, the amount of adjustment you would need to make your compass, that's where the least amount of adjustments are made, where the flat and the spherical maps most closely align.
Wow. What do you make of that?
I don't know. I don't know what to make of it.
Wow.
And it's the same thing. I know we're getting ahead here with time zones.
Yeah.
So in the Northern Hemisphere, there are 19 time zones. In the Southern Hemisphere,
32 right?
And 24 at the equator.
Yeah.
And you'd expect 24 time zones. It'd be really easy to do 24 hours in a day. It's really simple on a flat map to have 24 time zones. And and if you were to compress the circumference of the flat map and bring it into the Southern Hemisphere on a sphere, you'd have to create all sorts of extra time zones and compress. And so some people would say that the time zone differences are all political, but you could see it if you were trying to hide the true map of Earth. Mm-hmm. You could conceal it by having different time zones in the north and the south.
Yeah.
And then having the most alignment at the equator, the 24 with the flat, like that. There's something that seems interesting.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. The other one is lunar eclipses.
Yeah, and in particular, there's a type of lunar eclipse that anyone in your audience can look up. It's called a Selenelian lunar eclipse, S-E-L-E-N, Selenelian. And this is a type of lunar eclipse where the eclipsed moon and the sun are visible at the same time. Why is that a problem? Because that eclipse is supposed to be caused by Earth getting in between the sun and the moon. But if you can see them at the same time, they're above the horizon, what's going on? And I quoted a science website that was like, this seems impossible. Mm-hmm. And the answer is refraction. That what you see is a mirage.
That you're not actually seeing the sun and the moon. That's what they're saying.
Yes.
You're seeing a refracted projection of it, essentially.
Yes.
Light bending in order to...
I wish I could show your audience this picture. The picture of what's described, where you're basically at the top of the ball and the sun and the moon are below you.
Right. Because the Earth is supposed to be in between them at this point.
But what you see is that they're both above.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually here, but this is a mirage, and they're both refracting, so you see them.
Mm-hmm. That's what they claim. Yeah, it makes no sense.
Right. And we're not going to claim to know what causes the eclipse. That could be a much longer discussion.
Right.
The point is, does the globe model accommodate it? Mm-hmm. The globe model says the Earth is a globe and is getting in between the two and causing this eclipse. And yet they're both visible at the same time.
Yeah, that's a big problem. Yeah. And refraction is the rescue device that they always claim.
Yeah. That it's an illusion. What you see is not actually there.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a funny clip by Owen Benjamin he calls it Globe Earth Sniper. Uh-huh. It's a funny cartoon where he's got this sniper who's trying to shoot. And he's a Globe Earth sniper, and the other guy is just like a normal sniper. And the Globe Earth sniper is like, I see the guy here, but actually I just did the calculations and it's a mirage. I'm not going to shoot at him. And his colleague's like, no, he's right there. You got to shoot right now. He's like, no, I did the math. He's actually not there.
If he's there, this would falsify my beliefs, right? That's what he says in the thing. Yeah. In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. Oh, I really appreciate Owen lately too, as it relates to the 24-hour sun thing. And I was going to bring this up earlier, but I totally forgot, because there are a lot of people who are skeptical of the globe that have made the claim, which is logically fallacious itself, that 24-hour sun would prove the globe and it would be the end of, quote, flat earth.
Yeah.
And first off, again, that's affirming the consequent. There are plenty of other explanations. One, for example, and we're not making the claim that this is what causes 24-hour sun in Antarctica, but I don't think coffee cup caustic necessarily explains that phenomenon. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, if it does. But there are examples of people on YouTube taking a sort of glass dome, and then again, this is presupposing dome, and I'm not claiming that there is or is not a dome, but a glass dome, and then putting a light source inside of it and showing that no matter where you are on the perimeter of that light source, you can see that light. And you'll have to watch the YouTube example of what I'm talking about. But the point is, there are other ways to explain 24-hour sun. But I really appreciate what Owen has said. He's like, yeah, if you subscribe to a model of reality, if you subscribe and adhere strictly to a model, then this is going to throw a wrench in your model. But that's the whole point, is that reality itself does not adhere to our man-made models. And I really appreciate that he said that.
Yeah. And that's the danger of what we've seen in the, let's say, part of the globe skeptic community, people getting too locked into a particular model. And in my book, I do talk about the 24-hour sun in Southern Hemisphere during the summer, and the fact that many globe skeptics, or let's just say flat earthers, said before that if they observed the sun in the sky for 24 hours versus sunlight without seeing the sun in the sky, there's a distinction, that would be the end of flat earth, or things to that effect, or alluding to it. But I do mention in the book, I say, like, there might, unless there are other variables that are not being considered. And I think that's where the globe skeptic community is now. We'll see where it goes, right, in terms of how to explain it. I don't know how to explain a lot of things with it. But again, just because the globe can accommodate the observation doesn't mean the globe is correct. There could be another model. Especially when it comes to the countless other pieces that we've falsified here. Again, going back to your black swan example, if you find one black swan within an accepted model, then you need to rethink the whole model. Right. And that applies to either if you subscribe to a flat earth model or the globe model. If you find one black swan, then you need to rethink the whole model. Yeah. And I just want to say, just to get your audience thinking creatively, because we get often locked into this heliocentric model of a certain number of planets, and there's the sun and the moon. There are some weird things out there. And I'm not going to make any claims about what's true with this, but it's worth thinking in terms of creativity. There was a documentary in 2019 by Crow 777, the host of Crow 777 Radio. It's called Shoot the Moon, where he looks at these things that are known as lunar waves, where if he, using his telescope, and he's got some advanced technology, looking at it very precisely, it looks like the moon is in a fluid medium. Like there's almost waves of water that are distorting the moon at certain points. and even the space around it, which some people say, well, this is just like what the Bible says, the water's above, the water's below. There's a firmament, there's something that's that what we say is space is not a vacuum. There's some fluid medium. But in that documentary, he also has video footage of what appears to be two suns.
Interesting.
Two light sources, and they're a little bit, I'm trying to remember, one is yellowish and one's a little more orange, but he says he had tried to adjust for all the optical errors that could be there, but there were these two sun-like distinct things. And in Chinese mythology, they talked about multiple suns. There was a period of 10 suns in the sky, and there are others who talk about a black sun that's beneath.
Yeah.
And the same thing, there's anomalies with the moon. I believe there's some cultures that said there was a period when the moon wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes back to one of the 9 points about like what we observe today. How do we know that's like what it has been in the past? Right. And maybe it can change. So there just might be weird variables. And when we start getting into interdimensional aspects too, I don't know what to think.
Right.
So when we're in the box of just the materialism and the mainstream cosmology in terms of what's possible, I agree it's hard to get outside the globe. But when we expand beyond that, there might be many more mystical things out there. And mainstream science is heavily materialistic. This is where I started my work and into upside down thinking, moving away from this paradigm that consciousness and maybe even ether is related to this.
Right.
That there are multidimensional things happening and reality is way more malleable and mystical than mainstream science wants to believe. And they're stuck in the materialist paradigm, so they would never consider much of this.
That's why I appreciate Veda Austin's work so much, because at the very least, it is an indication that reality is a lot more malleable by, you could say, the cause there being consciousness. Now, can you isolate consciousness in order to vary and manipulate it to see if it produces the effect? I don't think so. It's a non-physical thing as far as I'm concerned. But the point is, Veda's work, and I would say the work of Dr. Masaru Emoto, and I'm sure I could think of other examples here, are indicating that our thought energy, which I like to call thought and feeling combined and oriented towards something, can dramatically impact the physical expression and orientation and structure of water. And given that water permeates all facets of reality, you might be able to make an argument, or let's say more research needs to be done into this area regarding consciousness impacting the actual way physical reality is oriented and structured. And I'm not making any assertions here. I'm just saying it is pretty interesting what Veda is indicating, and then Dr. Masaru Emoto and arguably Gerald Pollack and others as well.
Right. And then also work outside of just water, of the phenomenon of psychokinesis, of mind-matter interactions. I'm on the board of an organization called the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dr. Dean Radin and the scientists there have been studying this for a very long time, showing that the human mind is capable of affecting observations in reality and of actually affecting the world. So when we start getting into the notion of malleability, it really changes things.
Totally.
Because we don't know what's actually physical, and things might appear to be solid, but they're not, and they can change over time. So the point is, lots of variables here. And then there's one more point I want to make, because this has affected a lot of people on the sun and the moon. The globe's explanation of normal eclipses, the fact that they appear to be the same size, the sun and the moon. Think about that for a second. The sun is supposed to be 93 million miles away, and the moon's supposed to be about 238,000 miles away. And the eclipses occur in the globe model just such that one covers the other perfectly, like they're the same size. That the ratios of their respective sizes and distances are just so perfect that we have eclipses that way. Or are the sizes and distances from the globe model wrong?
Right. Isn't there a problem too with triangulating the sun in the sky?
Yes, I've heard people talk about this, and I think it's one of the reasons that even, let's say, the globe skeptic community is hesitant to give a size and distance, because there are some issues with that.
Totally.
So I'm not exactly familiar on the math of it.
What about entropy, second law of thermodynamics? Have you explored that as it relates to gas pressure?
Are you talking about the firmament stuff?
Yeah. Well, no, I won't even say the firmament.
Oh, yeah.
Let's say
enclosure.
Yeah, their claim that we exist in a gas pressure system without a closed container next to a vacuum.
Yeah, this was a powerful one for me too. And I mentioned the book, Steve Young, again, theoretical physics PhD, talking about this in his book, A Fool's Wisdom. Mm-hmm. If you open a can of soda, which has a bunch of gas in it, high pressure gas, you open it up, there's a loud noise. because the higher pressure gas from the inside has to diffuse out into the lower pressure gas around it until an equilibrium is reached, basically. This is basic laws of physics.
Right.
We end up in a problem when we think about Earth when applying this stuff, because we're supposed to exist, the ball of Earth, in a vacuum of space. A vacuum, we're not talking about a vacuum cleaner. We're talking about an extremely low pressure system.
Right.
Meaning if it's next to a relatively higher pressure system, the gas from the higher pressure system, if there's no enclosure, should diffuse out into this low pressure vacuum. We're talking major low pressure because it's an infinite vacuum and Earth is continuing to expand. So it's nearly an infinite vacuum of nearly no pressure.
Right.
So there's a massive gradient differential between the vacuum of space and Earth, which clearly has something because there are gases that are contained within Earth.
Right. And they'll say that it's ultimately gravity, but again, going back to the falsification of dark matter means that there's poking major holes in gravity. So to say that gravity is the cause of the phenomenon of gas remaining at a sort of pressure gradient to a point and then all of a sudden existing right next to an infinite vacuum can't possibly make sense.
Right. That the Earth's atmosphere peacefully coexists right next to the infinite vacuum of space,
right,
with no diffusion of the gases, just all getting sucked out, which is what you'd expect. So potentially like a violent sucking out of the gases here to this extremely low pressure vacuum. That doesn't occur because Earth is supposed to exist in an open system. It's not enclosed like a can of soda is a closed system.
Right.
And this leads many to believe that the current model cannot be correct, and there must be some kind of enclosure, something that's separating the pressure that we know exists on Earth with whatever's out there beyond, whether it's an infinite vacuum or if it's a fluid medium or something, that there's some enclosure. The biblical terminology is firmament. I don't know. I'm not going to make any claims about it, but that's the term that's often used.
Right. The other thing with that relates to some sort of enclosure is you'll often see people when, let's say, globe skeptics say, how come we can't feel and experience all of these actions that the Earth is allegedly doing, like, spinning, rotating, wobbling, going all the way through space at, thousands and thousands of miles per hour. We don't feel any of it. And they'll point to, okay, well, when you're in an airplane, you don't feel the airplane moving necessarily, or when you're in a car, you don't feel the wind hitting your face and stuff like this. To which my response is the airplane topless? Is a car topless? No. The reason you don't feel any of those effects is because you're in a what? Closed container. The moment that you roll down your window or something like this, you do experience those effects. And that's the point. So when they point to, well, you don't feel it in an airplane, you don't feel it in a car, et cetera, yes, there's a reason for that. And it's because you're in a closed container there.
Right. And some will say you don't feel it because the motion's perfectly constant, which is, it sounds a bit far-fetched. Say that there's no motion that's not constant at all. Like even a little blip, if you're moving that fast, you would feel that. So it presumes, especially for the perspective of many materialist Big Bang theorists, who would say that there's no intelligent design of any kind or no spiritual force. There's this perfection of Earth's motion that is perfectly constant in all these different motions, so you never feel it at all. Earth also has an elliptical motion around the sun under the globe model, so it wouldn't be perfectly constant.
Right.
But so there's some strange things. Like if there is any speeding up or slowing down or any blip, any bump Earth encounters, we should feel that. And we don't feel that.
Have you thought about too how, okay, so if we are spinning and then also revolving around the sun, which is their claim, and then satellites are supposed to be rotating around us, and they're supposed to remain constant throughout the sky, like their trajectory throughout the sky is constant. If again we're spinning and revolving around the sun, wouldn't that mean at certain points with the satellites going around us that the satellite has to speed up at some times and then slow down at other times relative to our motion around the sun?
Interesting. I have not thought about that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think you understand what I'm saying.
I understand
right?
what you're saying. I would love to talk to a satellite engineer.
Yeah. Because that would
How do you
mean
do that?
that at certain points, the satellite is having to speed up, and in some points it's slowing down in order to remain constant in its trajectory across the sky relative to us who are spinning and then revolving around the sun. Am I explaining that well? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I get it. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
But you're also speaking to a broader point, which I hope your audience is appreciating.
Yeah.
That when you start questioning this stuff, Like every aspect of technology and cosmology, you have to rethink.
Right.
And that's why this is so hard, because it's everything. With virology, it's pretty hard because you have to think, like, what's an antiviral? What's a PCR test? This is everything.
It's everything about reality.
About reality and physics.
Right. Which is why it's such a big deal, though.
Yeah.
It really is such a big deal. Okay, I want to get into NASA now. Do you think it's appropriate to head there? Do you feel like we've covered most of the stuff in your book as it relates to falsifying pieces of the accepted model? Is there anything else that we missed?
There's a quote from Einstein. I'll paraphrase it because I don't have it right here. But
yeah.
He said that I don't think that Earth's motion can be detected using any optical experiment, even though he said he retained his heliocentric belief that the sun's at the center. Pretty interesting.
Well, actually, that brings up a really good point, and it relates to, so you and I are in a chat group, and I'm not going to name names or anything, but we're in a chat group where what I've been trying to convey in the group with this individual who is making claims about the globe is that in order to test a hypothesis with respect to natural science, the hypothesis would then relate to a cause and effect claim. So in order to say that X is the cause of Y, you need to have X to vary and manipulate to see if it produces the observed phenomenon in question, Y. And what it happens, which is what I'm trying to indicate in this group, and what happens in every single case, I think I can say that pretty conclusively at this point, when it comes to claims surrounding globe, spinning ball, whatever you want to call the belief, is the cause for Y, that is presupposing globe. Because in order to test to see if globe, spinning ball, whatever you want to call it, is the cause of Y, you need to have spinning globe as the X independent variable to vary and manipulate to see if it produces Y. You cannot proceed to assume spinning ball and then conduct experiments seeing if it causes Y without having that thing to vary and manipulate. And I'm not saying that we don't live on Earth. What I'm saying is the specific claim that globe is the cause for the observed effect in question. If you can't vary and manipulate the amount of globe while controlling for all other variables, then it is not adhering to the scientific method. And you're presupposing globe and then affirming the consequent by pointing to effects as proof of cause, as proof of globe. And that's like a really big point here when it comes to any claims regarding the cosmos and regarding the shape of the earth and what these effects are pointing to.
So tag on to that, this debate about heliocentrism versus geocentrism, which I remember learning about in high school. So geocentrism, the idea that Earth is at the center, often associated with a stationary Earth at the center, and everything that we see is moving around us, versus heliocentrism, sun's at the center, Earth revolves around the sun. There are many credible scientists who have said that these are, the technical term is kinematically equivalent, meaning that based on the observations of what we see in the sky, you can't tell if it's Earth is geocentric or heliocentric, if that's where we live. And I just want to quote a few scientists so your audience believes me, because we're getting into this affirming the consequent realm where, for example, Galileo, he observed things in his telescope, and then all of a sudden, wow, he has confirmed Copernicus's heliocentric model. Now we know it's heliocentrism. What did Galileo observe? He observed the phases of Venus, which are sort of like the phases of the moon, and he observed the Jupiter and the moon of Jupiter. Does that prove heliocentrism? The phases of Venus actually can be explained under Tycho's geocentric model, where the planets in the sky, the wandering stars, move around the sun in a particular way while the sun moves around Earth. So you could explain it using heliocentrism or geocentrism. Mm-hmm. Galileo didn't prove heliocentrism. And the same thing goes with his observations of the moons of Jupiter, that just because you have smaller objects moving around bigger ones, that's the observation of the telescope. Does that mean that Earth revolves around the sun? You have to presuppose a lot based on something you see out there to say that we are that. Could his observations support heliocentrism? Yes, but not exclusively. So I'll quote Fred Hoyle, famous astronomer. Let it be understood at the outset that it makes no difference from the point of view of describing planetary motion, whether we take the Earth or the sun as the center of the solar system. Since the issue is one of relative motion only, there are infinitely many exactly equivalent descriptions referred to different centers. In principle, any point will do. And then another physicist, I. Bernard Cohen, there is no planetary observation by which we on Earth can prove that the Earth is moving in an orbit around the sun. Einstein said this, Stephen Hawking said this as well. So we run into this affirming the consequent constantly, where people observe something and they say the heliocentric model can explain this. Therefore, the heliocentric model is correct. Could be correct, but other models can explain it too. And those other models are not being considered.
Right, exactly. And this is where I think there's one more important point that I want to make is that each claim needs to be analyzed in and of itself. Not necessarily relative to other tenets or aspects of the model. Because going back to your black swan example, if one claim related to an entire model of which other pieces of said model are reliant on the tenets of that claim is falsified, then you do have to question every other aspect of the model, which is why I say models are not reality. Models could possibly be parts of reality. Models, maybe you could say someone could at some day come up with a model to sufficiently describe all aspects of reality with no contradictions. But at this point, no one has even come freaking close to that. So we can say pretty conclusively, models aren't reality. So the point is, each claim needs to be taken on its face in isolation in order to determine the viability of it on its own.
Right. Another way I phrase it, you said this earlier, is if someone has a belief, the first step is to ask, how do you know that belief is true? And as we've looked into things more and more, what I'm finding is that what we're told about reality or politics is the assumptions underlying those beliefs are often very shaky.
Yes.
And people are hesitant, I find, to ask those questions, to say, well, no, a PhD said it's true, so we don't need to ask that assumption. And I've talked to doctors about this with regard to contagion. Say, like, how do you know a virus exists and causes disease and can be transmitted from person to person? And they'll be like, well, there were studies done 100 years ago that validated this. And have you looked at those studies? No, I haven't looked at those. I mean, but so that's what's required really for all this stuff is if a claim's put forward, we've got to look back at the foundational elements of it. And that's why we're talking about studies from George Airy, 1871, Michelson Morley, 1887.
And what's so frustrating is people will then say, well, those studies are older. I'm like, yes, but everything now is predicated on those original studies. So you can't just say, oh, those studies are old. We have modern technology now to validate our claims now, when the modern claims are reliant on those original claims that were way back when.
Yeah. And Austin Whitsett's done a really good job of compiling these studies that after the 1887 Michelson-Morley study, there were many replications done of it. And they get the same result because they're presupposing that Earth is moving. So therefore they say the ether has been debunked. But this is all foundational stuff. So now what do mainstream scientists say? Or if you get a PhD in physics, I'm sure from the get-go, yeah, ether's been disproven. That was done a long time ago. Yeah. Same thing, contagion, that's been established using the scientific method. That was done a long time ago.
Yep, starting with that presupposition. And this leads to another point, and this relates to NASA, actually, so it'd be good to get into this now and some claims regarding moon landing and just space footage, et cetera, is that the overwhelming majority of people, if not like virtually all, I would imagine, who join an agency like NASA, and I'll relate it back to my time in the Army, are well-intentioned people who believe the foundational claims without analyzing them, believe the people to their left and their right in various other subdomains, you could say, of NASA or really any agency, are doing what they're supposed to be doing and that their claims have been validated, et cetera, and they themselves are just doing their job that's in front of them. And they're well-intentioned people. I don't think they're in on this grand scheme to manipulate everyone. Like virologists. I don't think virologists are in on this grand scheme to manipulate everyone. They've been taught, we already know that viruses exist, and we already know that cytopathic effect after a certain period of time in culture is indicative of a virus, and these little particles and electron micrograph images are viruses. We've already established this well before you've come into the equation now as a virologist. And they believe that foundational premise and they just proceed forward. They're not bad people. They're not in on this grand scheme. They're just accepting these foundations without question and proceeding forward to build upon them. And everything is compartmentalized and everyone's just doing their job. And there may be some people at the tippy top who might know the truth, but I'm not going to assert that that's the case either. They may be coming from a flawed premise. But the point is, you and I aren't sitting here claiming that everyone is in NASA's in on this grand scheme to manipulate people.
Right. And there are major pressures that you're also alluding to that would cause people maybe not to speak out if they had a question. Financial pressure. I mean, you could lose your job if you question, do viruses exist and cause disease? Could you imagine as a virologist or a doctor to ask these questions? And we know what's happened to some people who've spoken out. It's financially and personally very damaging to people. But you're reminding me of what Pavel Krupa said. He's the astrophysicist from the University of Bonn who's worked on falsifying dark matter. He was asked in an interview, well, if you falsified dark matter, why is this such a hot topic that everyone's trying to study? And he says it's because of sociological pressures. This is where all the funding is going to study dark matter. This is where you win prizes. And if you're early in your career, do you really want to step out and speak out against this stuff? So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Have you asked ChatGPT or any AI what the potential financial ramifications are of upending the heliocentric model?
That would be a good one to ask. I know you've done it with virology. Yeah. I have not done it.
So with virology, when I asked Meta AI, it gave a figure of $2.5 to $5.3 trillion, which is a ton of money. ChatGPT gave a figure of 10 point something to 20 point something trillion dollars as the potential financial ramifications of upending the virological model, because you're thinking not only the primary industries that are impacted by it, like the pharmaceutical industry, the health industry, but there's second and third order effects. Off the top of my head, something like the way that car filters, like air filters, are designed, I would bet are largely or to some degree based on the idea of viruses and filtering out, quote, viral particles. Maybe that's not a good example, but the point is there are other industries that are not directly tied to virology that ultimately, if virology is falsified, would have to question some of their pieces that they've adhered to in order to put forth the products and the paradigms that they're teaching, et cetera, et cetera. I bet it would be even worse when it comes to this, though, because we're not talking about one subset of reality. We're talking about reality and the ground we stand on itself.
Right. And we start getting into, first of all of physics has to be questioned, which gets into every technology. The defense industry, I mean, NASA's budget alone, just confirming it here, $25 billion budget in 2025, $68 million per day. So there's a lot at stake here. And what's interesting, if we take, I want to find the exact quote from Pavel Krupa. This is on the falsification of dark matter. Our model of the universe has been falsified. The cosmological standard model is wrong. I mean, that's just so in your face.
Yeah.
But what happens in our space agencies and NASA? They are working on the current cosmological model. So what would the falsification of dark matter imply for all of what's at stake financially? That would be a good one to ask GPT about.
It's a big deal. It's a freaking big deal. That's all I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just a side note here, because I was asking ChatGPT about this was Claude's Anthropic's Claude AI. I had trained it on dark matter falsification. It was like, the spinning globe is impossible. I'm not going to tell you what's true as the model, but it's impossible once you falsify dark matter.
That's what it said.
That's what it told me.
Just to be clear, that wasn't you manipulating it. It was you just asking a series of logical questions based on their own claims and then basically inviting it to come to its own conclusion based on their own claims.
Yes, it didn't start there because it didn't make the connection between dark matter and gravity.
Totally.
It likes to start by saying, well, gravity explains things really well on a local scale and dark matter is this big cosmic thing. And then I got it to say, no. These are intimately connected because dark matter was conceived as a post hoc rationalization to explain gravity and Einstein's relativity's predictions.
Right.
So once I trained it in all that, I would say, what's the probability that the Earth is a spinning globe? And it would say it's impossible, 0%, repeatedly. But then I told it about the observations in Antarctica after I had trained it on dark matter, and it was very firm with me. It did not revert to Earth as a spinning globe.
You're saying like the recent
observations of a 24-hour sun in Antarctica, it did not revert to a spinning globe. It said there needs to be some other model that can accommodate this because the dark matter falsification is that strong.
Wow.
And I asked it to give a series of explanations, and they were all like kind of convoluted things. But that was interesting to me.
Yeah. This goes back to what's that ninth point, that like just because we can't conceive of it doesn't mean that it's not true. There's plenty of other explanations for what causes the phenomenon of 24-hour sun that exist outside of the currently accepted quote globe model, and we're probably not able to conceive of like a good number of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me that AI held its ground in that case.
Yeah.
Because the falsification of dark matter and therefore gravity was that strong.
Yeah.
That it didn't revert to, oh, the globe is true, which is what some people I think are doing now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it leaves us in this place of I don't know, which is hopefully where this conversation.
Dude, that's where I'm at. I have no clue where we're at. I have no clue what we're on. I just know that there are multiple ways to falsify the idea that we're on a spinning ball whirling through a space vacuum.
Right. And when you have
that's it.
Mainstream astrophysicists saying our model of the universe has been falsified, we have to rethink things.
Yeah.
Every part of it.
It's a big deal, man. It's a really big deal. Okay, let's go with NASA now, because a lot of people will point to some of NASA's claims and some of NASA's claimed footage and photographs, et cetera, as proof of the globe. Why is that problematic?
Well, first of all, we don't have footage of a globe, which is a sphere. So the images that we get, so the 1972 blue marble example, which was allegedly taken from the moon, look at it. It's you see a disc, you see a circle, and you're supposed to extrapolate sphericity, a full ball. So you don't actually see it. But we also have issues of CGI, so computer generated imagery, and composite imagery, where you take a bunch of images and put them together, and then even artist renditions. I went on NASA's website and they have artist renditions of certain things, and they say artist rendition. They're super clear on it. But going back to the blue marble example, because that was on all the iPhones, so people have ingrained in their minds this vision of Earth.
Yeah.
The NASA artist has done interviews on this. He's an artist, and he photoshopped it. And there's details on what he had to basically finagle based on what he thought astronauts would be seeing.
Wow. So he admits that.
He admits it. My book, I quote him in his interviews talking about it. This is admitted. So we don't have non-doctored imagery.
Right.
The last one is supposedly from 1972. And again, that's not a full sphere.
Mm-hmm.
That everything else we have is some kind of computer-generated imagery or composite. So we end up having to extrapolate based on the images that we get. I mean, the two things, as I was writing, I'm like, I would love to see video footage of Earth doing a full rotation, continuous raw footage, where you could zoom in and see buildings on the top standing up straight, hanging sideways on the side, and hanging upside down on the bottom, because that's what the model posits.
Right.
To be able to see all of that. But instead, we get this kind of vague, ambiguous imagery from a satellite, or from like Felix Baumgartner did like an expedition where he went up really high and took pictures. They were using a fisheye lens, which creates artificial. So it creates artificial curvature that's not actually there.
Right.
The point is that we're asked to extrapolate from these images what the full sphere is.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't actually have that, which to me is very curious.
It is, because I presume that we have the technology to do this. Like, do they claim that we don't?
I've messed with AI on this one.
Yeah.
On like, just tell me how grand NASA's technology is and how complex it is to make it to the moon multiple times and send human beings there and to send these probes out into deep space. So I prime it with that of how complex all that stuff is.
Yeah.
And then I'll say, explain to me why we don't have video footage taken from space of the full sphere of Earth doing just one rotation.
Uh-huh.
And it runs into problems with that. So depending on the AI you use, sometimes it'll defer and say, well, actually, it's really complex to do that and we can't explain it. Right. Other AIs will be like, actually, that's a really good point. That should raise questions for people.
Yeah.
Because I just want to harp on this so much. I feel like we've gotten used to accepting indirect evidence. Same thing with virology and contagion. Forgive me if I'm asking for too much, but if we're going to shut down the world, I would love to see this particle infecting someone's cells, causing symptoms, and then jumping to one other person and causing the same symptoms.
Right. Or at the least, you would expect, given the CDC and other health agencies are making these claims and then proceeding to recommend, if not declare and order us to shut down and do all these ridiculous health measures, that when pressed for evidence that these particles exist in the fluids of a sick person, taken directly from the fluids of a sick person, they would have said evidence. And as Christine Massey has shown, they don't have it.
Yeah.
They're the ones making those claims.
Freedom of information requests, the CDC, many other health organizations saying we do not have a truly purified sample of just the virus. These are basic things we're asking for.
Yeah.
Just to have an independent variable in the virology study, so then you could have a proper control, and then you could be following the scientific method. So it's the same thing with the space stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you're claiming a spinning ball, can you please show me a spinning ball?
Right.
But I'm sure a lot of people will get upset that I'm asking for too much and it's complex. And we have all this stuff from the ISS where you can sort of see curvature. What are you actually seeing from the ISS? You're seeing from one point above Earth,
right,
a limited sample. That is not actually telling you what we want to know.
Right. Right. Exactly. And with the composite images, these sort of artistic renderings, one thing that really stood out to me, and I don't remember the exact years, but if you compare the size of North America, let's say, on one of the NASA official blue marble images to another NASA blue marble image a couple years prior or a couple years after, the relative size of North America on one versus the other is insane, and it's visible to the naked eye. If you just compare them side by side, North America takes up a huge chunk of the blue marble on one relative to the other, where it looks incredibly tiny. And how can you explain that anomaly if these are indeed true depictions of what the Earth and all of the continents' size and shape are on a globe?
Yeah, you're making an important general point, which is that we have to really scrutinize any of these images and say, does this match what the globe model says in terms of the radius value, in terms of the sizes that should be there? And if we're looking at, let's say, from the ISS and we see an image, or from SpaceX or something, and there's some curvature that's sort of ambiguous, we'd have to ask, is the curvature that's shown consistent with the radius value of Earth and the altitude? Like, that's math that you can do. And then you'd have to look at what's shown below. And is that the amount of landmass that you should see?
Right.
And that sort of analysis often doesn't happen. It's an intellectual laziness, which I myself was very much guilty of. You see a picture, it sort of looks curved, and maybe it's not even down and away curvature, it's just circular curvature, and you call it a day and say it's proven. Like, we have to scrutinize that. And I've started to use AI, I don't know if you can, where I take some images that are from some of these expeditions like SpaceX and other things, and I say, given the altitude of this picture, which it can find, is this the amount of curvature you would expect based on the Earth's radius value? And I got one to say, no, this is not the curvature you'd expect.
This is an important point too, because one of our mutual friends, let's say, has brought up lately that he has a friend who works in NASA who has been sending him undoctored image or footage from ISS and other cameras in space, let's say, that are clearly showing that not all of NASA's footage is doctored or CGI. Even if that were the case, that doesn't tell us everything we would need to know about the accepted model. You're just seeing a small chunk of it, just like you're indicating here. You might see curvature, but is it circular curvature or the type of curvature around a sphere of falling away? It doesn't tell us that the accepted model or the globe is true.
Right. We need there should be a specific amount of down and away curvature and a specific land mass is observed.
Right.
That's the analysis that really should be done.
Exactly.
But what do we get? And I'm going to quote, this is the NASA artist. This is the blue marble. He said, then we wrapped the flat map around a ball. My part was integrating the surface, clouds, and oceans to match people's expectations of how Earth looks from space. He also said, it is photoshopped, but it has to be.
Does he say why it has to be?
Yeah, he says, my job is primarily taking data and making pictures out of it. To us, the really cool thing was the data set. Up until that point, there was no realistic color map of the globe anywhere. He describes in this interview that the images that came from an instrument that measures phytoplankton, which affected the way he would design the final image of Earth. He ultimately colored Earth's water based on phytoplankton quantities. He said, where the phytoplankton count was low, I colored it dark blue because they're low mostly in mid-oceans. And then where it's a little bit higher, it was a little bit brighter green. There's a small problem with this because a very slight gap because there's a very slight gap in between each orbit. So this is why he had to make his estimations.
Wow. All based on phytoplankton.
And things like it, and like what the clouds should look
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
and the
yeah.
data. So he's getting in data and trying to reverse engineer what it would look like.
Yeah. It's just so interesting when you see these so-called deep space photos of, quote, other planets. Like, how come we can't have the exact same thing for Earth? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the supposed pictures of Jupiter that they claim. I mean, I don't even know if they claim that those are genuine photographs or if they're just pictures.
It depends on the image, but I went to NASA's, there's like a photo library, and I think there are a bunch that are, actually I'm not sure about some of those.
Yeah.
Because there's one that I quoted that was an artist rendition. But your point is well taken. Like, why shouldn't we have that level of granularity? But we're all inundated with images that we're not told are composite, or,
Right.
well, it's just pretty close, don't worry about it.
Right.
But if people knew that, whoa, 1972 was the last alleged one
And
taken
I
of
question
Earth.
whether that one is too. Exactly.
There's good reason to question that. And
Yeah.
again, that's not a full sphere,
Yeah.
and that's been photoshopped to be on all the iPhones. This is just weird stuff. And this is why I had to write the book when I started looking at it.
Yeah.
I'm like, if people knew this, they would really ask
You
questions.
can't not look, man. Hey, y'all. I'm here with Melissa Kupsch from Remedy Academy of Homeopathy. We are so stoked here at the Way Forward to be partnering with Melissa and Remedy in order to spread the message of homeopathy across the world, and also to partner on the eventual development of healing centers across the United States.
People are pretty quickly coming to realize that frequency is the future of medicine. We are witnessing the great resurgence of homeopathy right now. We're really moving away from that suppressive medical model. Whether it's for eczema, asthma, hormones, fertility, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it is, it all starts as energy in the person's field first. If we change our field, we can completely change our life. Our 2-year academy is open worldwide to anyone who wants to become a homeopath. We've got 5 lecturers, and we currently have over 500 students enrolled, which is record numbers in our field. A career in homeopathy is amazing for anyone who wants flexibility in their work and who wants to be valuable in creating this new world. We have stay-at-home parents enrolled, we have ex-medical professionals, grandparents signed up who want to learn how to heal their grandchildren and pass on that invaluable knowledge. We even have husband and wife teams. So my husband enrolled in the course with no prior knowledge of health as a background, and he is loving it.
Kylie is also enrolled as well, so my partner is, and she's so stoked to become a homeopath and to be helping to spread this message across the world.
The thing that we hear from so many of our students is, I found my thing. Homeopathy is the key. We harness frequencies from nature and we alter the field of all creations. So if anybody wants to join us or they want to know more about it, they can visit our website.
Yeah, and all that information will be in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about Remedy Academy, also Remedy Collective, also some of the homeopathic products that they have, please just head to the show notes. All of that will be listed there. Okay, the one that I want to explore now as it relates to NASA and exploration of space is the moon landing. Because at the very least, you don't necessarily have to, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, question the globe in order to question the moon landing. But let's go there next.
Yeah, an example is Bart Sibrel, who's probably the biggest moon landing skeptic. I believe he is a globe mainstream cosmology believer.
Mm-hmm.
So these are not, and it's worth stating also that there are different beliefs we're talking about, because we're talking about cosmology in general. Like the Big Bang is a specific belief. 13.8 billion years ago, it started the Earth, started everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then now we have Earth revolving around the sun because of that. There's geocentrism versus heliocentrism. You could believe in geocentrism, Earth at the center, while believing Earth is a sphere.
Right.
And Robert Sungenis is one of the biggest proponents of geocentrism. He wrote a book called Flat Earth, Flat Wrong. And yet he's a geocentrist. He was actually on Tim Pool recently with Austin Whitsitt, who is a geocentric globe skeptic.
Right.
So there are these varying beliefs you can have, and moon landings is one of them. I think if you are a globe skeptic, most globe skeptics are moon landing skeptics too. Like, and if you believe in flat Earth and a firmament or some kind of enclosure, moon landings are a physical impossibility.
There.
Although I guess it depends on your definition of what the moon is, if it's more local.
Right. But maybe within the quote firmament, if you believe that, like maybe. But I don't know if anyone who subscribes to the belief that again, belief. No one's
Yes.
making an assertion here. The belief that there is a firmament while also believing it's possible to, quote, land on the moon.
Right.
I don't know if
It's
anyone.
low over. I haven't come across one person.
Yeah.
So usually globe skeptics are moon landing skeptics too, but
Totally.
moon landing skeptics are not necessarily globe skeptics.
Right, right.
That's an important point. And I struggle with a lot of this stuff, like, because I do start to ask myself, could all these people be lying? And I agree with you that many of them are just compartmentalized and they're working with data and don't realize. And I was the low man on the totem pole at a large investment bank in the beginning of my career. I didn't know what was going on in the top levels. I was just running the financial models because this deal was supposed to happen. Who knows what I was involved with? Like, I don't know.
Exactly. And the same can apply to me being in the Army. When we would do war game exercises against, like, say, North Korea, because when I was in, there was heightened tensions between the U.S. and North Korea. I was involved in some of the, let's say, meetings because I was acting as an assistant S3, and then I was acting as an assistant FSO at the brigade level for some of the, quote, higher level information, but even then it was still severely compartmentalized. I had freaking no clue what the true mission set was or what was going on to my left and right. I was only doing the job in front of me. And I assumed, I was starting the question at the time, but for all intents and purposes, I assumed that what we were talking about and what we were discussing was true, good, and moral, real. And I had no reason at that time to question otherwise.
Right.
The same can be said for a lot of industries. In a lot of paradigms.
So how many people are in that position where they think they're doing a good thing and they don't realize the bigger context? So that's one important thing to keep in mind. But there's no getting around conspiracy in this topic.
Right.
It's at some level, someone knows something and is hiding it. And that can be hard for people to acknowledge that level of deception and arguably evil. And what's interesting is that NASA's foundings are sketchy by most accounts. So Jack Parsons, who was part of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a big part of NASA's founding, he was doing occult rituals based on Aleister Crowley's teachings with the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, in the desert trying to basically summon the Antichrist. This is an acknowledged thing. And there are lots of articles on Jack Parsons that he was this occultist. And then one of the leaders of NASA, Werner von Braun, came over from Nazi Germany in Operation Paperclip. And that has been a very controversial thing for people to acknowledge that an actual SS officer from Nazi Germany was part of this organization.
And what's on his tombstone?
It is a proverb talking about the firmament.
Interesting.
It is interesting. And he was also very, very involved with Walt Disney. Mm-hmm. And Walt Disney and Disney Productions have started to propagate the space narrative heavily. So there's weird stuff here. And this is interesting. So I was playing around with ChatGPT and all the AIs on this. And because it gets to a hypocrisy that we see that I think is worth calling out everywhere, of like basically selective outrage. I said, should we trust an organization that was founded by a Nazi SS officer? And it was like, no, you absolutely shouldn't. And what if I told you that same organization was founded by an occultist that was doing sex rituals in the desert to try to summon the Antichrist? You should absolutely not trust that organization. It was very clear. And then I would say, well, I'm describing NASA. Should we trust NASA? And you'll see it flip of, well, it's actually a little different because we should trust NASA, and you'll see it defend the mainstream narrative. But it gets to like a broader political issue, which is worth calling out, because you'll have some people who have like outrage and calling other people Nazis who are actually not Nazis just because they might be pro-freedom or something, or conservative.
Or just questioning something.
And at the same time, they will defend NASA. Mm-hmm. Very interesting hypocrisy there.
Right. Yeah. Super interesting hypocrisy. Okay. Let's continue on with
So let me start with the way I actually start my chapter. And the reason I actually made the space agency stuff, chapter 6, is because you're getting into conspiracy. And before that, you can get to scientific stuff. And I think it's more palatable once you've questioned the science to say, okay, the current cosmological is wrong, as we're hearing from astrophysicists and for many other reasons we've discussed.
Right.
And space agencies are operating based on the current cosmological model. There's a disconnect here. Something must be going on. So it's a little more easier to accept there might be conspiracy or deception.
Totally.
And I start the chapter off with Igor Volk, who's a Russian astronaut. He received a medal for being a hero of the Soviet Union. This is a 2014 interview in Bulgaria, 3 years before he passed away. He said the following: "Look, the code of honor prevents the cosmonauts from talking about what happens in space. We haven't been to space. If someone claims that we have been, it is not true. It is not the truth. And this was confirmed 9 years after the interview by his interviewer from Bulgaria. In an interview himself, he spent time with Igor Volk and confirmed that this was legitimate, that this guy was saying it. I mean, that's just one data point. We could talk about a lot more from the chapter, but like, whoa.
Because couldn't someone who is skeptical of that claim say, okay, he's just talking about Russia, though. Only Russia has not been to space.
Right. But in the interview with the Bulgarian, when the Bulgarian interviewer was interviewed years later, he, I'm going to get you his exact quote. So the Bulgarian interviewer, his name was Karev was his last name. Karev interviewed Igor Volk, the cosmonaut. Karev was interviewed more recently. And in that interview, he was asked, but Igor Volk didn't tell you directly that the U.S. astronauts, Neil Armstrong and company, didn't go there? And Karev said to him, do you really need him to say that directly, considering that he's giving you the key?
Right. This is the key that unlocks all paradigms, essentially. It applies everywhere, is what he's saying.
Yeah. He's saying, look, he already told us that no one went to space.
Yeah.
Did he need to say that that Armstrong didn't go? And
Right. The one thing that really stood out that you covered in your book that I had not heard before or not considered before is that the U.S. is the only agency that I know of, maybe aside from India's so-called moon landing footage. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's what it was, right? And so much has happened in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
India claims to have landed on the moon, and the footage that they put forth is insane. But previous to that, no other country is claimed to have actually put men on the moon or to have men in orbit around the moon.
Right.
Only the U.S.
Yeah. But think about that, how few, it's a really small number of people that have been to the moon to be able to see Earth from that vantage point. The ISS, much lower altitude.
Right.
And what's the rest? The imagery from probes or other expeditions, they maybe go a little bit higher or something. So it's important to acknowledge that. The amount of direct evidence would come from those people who were on the Apollo missions. And there's a lot of reasons for skepticism, which we can talk about those missions. It was only like 3 at a time max.
Yep.
Just from an evidentiary standpoint, like that you didn't have any other reporters, any third parties monitoring this stuff, and then they end up going into bunkers for a few months afterwards.
Dude, and then when you look at those interviews after they get back, like, bro, if you had just been on the moon, how stoked would you be? How stoked would you be?
You achieved the greatest thing. And it looks like, I mean, the Neil Armstrong ones in particular, they look almost depressed.
Yeah. They look incredibly sad. Like they know something they shouldn't know, or they don't want to know, or they participated in something that they didn't actually want to participate in, or it was all a ruse. My point is, like, anyone I think could watch the interviews after the fact and be like, this is weird. They don't seem happy. They don't seem overjoyed that they just accomplished the most monumental task ever in the history, or in modern history, let's say.
Right. And we also haven't been back.
Right.
So, I mean, in decades. And apparently we lost the technology.
Yeah, quote, lost the technology. The other one that's so sketchy is that, correct me if I'm wrong on this, NASA claims to have taped over the original footage of the moon landing.
I'm going to read this to you. To me, NASA has admitted the following. This is their words. Aside from a few canisters of Apollo 9 telemetry tapes stored at the Washington National Record Center, the Apollo-era telemetry tapes no longer exist anywhere. This is quoted from the Apollo 11 telemetry data recordings, a final report. 2010 document. How could you not have the telemetry data from the most important missions?
One of the most important events in mankind.
In human history.
Yeah. Like, that's extremely questionable. Let's get into some of the other things, though, regarding those missions.
Yeah.
Because, like, the Van Allen radiation.
I want to tack on,
ahead.
because you're talking about the way, like, the almost despondent demeanor of the astronauts when they came back.
That's a good
Especially
word.
the first point, because I quoted a woman, she's a space psychologist, Ia Whiteley, and she's not looking at it from this perspective, the conspiratorial perspective. She's looking at it as a psychiatrist. She says, what is interesting to me, we had over a dozen astronauts that went to the moon, but we have actually heard genuine experience, But have we heard the actual genuine experience of what it is like looking back apart from the photograph? Have they had the language to communicate the transformation that happened to them? In fact, a lot of them have been ostracized from family, society, and they had to resort to drinking and being isolated because they could not communicate their experience. So she concludes that it's because they could not communicate their experience. But might there be other reasons
Right.
that something was very disturbing that they went through? And to me, we have to consider many possibilities. So
Right.
like non-disclosure agreements for sure.
Totally.
But also blackmail is a real thing that goes on in the world, unfortunately, and being threatened or
Right.
bribed. And then also mind control.
Totally.
So MK Ultra is a real program that has been declassified of doing horrible things to human beings to manipulate their memory, to even create multiple personalities. That's a real phenomenon. And I remember a little light bulb went off for me. I did my 2019 podcast series called Where's My Mind? And this was before I was looking at conspiracy outside of consciousness. But I interviewed Russell Targ, who was one of the leaders of the US government's secret spying program, psychic spying program. So like actually using the mind to see things far away.
Remote viewing.
Remote
essentially.
viewing.
Yep.
The name of it was called Stargate and went by a bunch of
Was
other
he
names.
with what was the other
Hal
guy's-
Puthoff.
No, there's another guy too that was an army. He was like an E5 or E6 in the army. Joseph McMoneagle. Was he a part of the same thing that Joseph
He was
McMoneagle
involved.
Okay,
McMoneagle
got it.
was one of their top remote viewers.
Got it. Okay.
And a bunch of others as well.
Yeah.
So these were like superstars, Michael Jordan, LeBron James level of remote viewing
Right.
that could see things. And Jimmy Carter, US president, confirmed that they needed to use psychics to find a downed Russian bomber that was lost
Crazy.
in an African jungle. This is a real program. When I interviewed him, and this is in episode 4 of Where's My Mind podcast, he was talking about all the agencies that funded this. Over $20 million went into it. And one of them was NASA. NASA's funding psychic spying. Why is NASA interested in the mind? Kind of interesting because psychic spying stuff is related somewhat to MK Ultra. It's a little bit different
Right.
because there weren't, at least as far as I know, who knows, they weren't torturing people in the experiments based on the scientists I've talked to, but it's in a similar realm of understanding the mind. So one has to wonder, could certain people who are involved in this have an experience and then get mind controlled where memories are implanted or they're forced to forget things? Or multiple personalities are created where you can
Interesting.
activate a new personality to say things, almost like the Manchurian Candidate, certain buzzwords. People who have been involved in mind control talk about this sort of thing. So keeping that in mind, Ia Whiteley talks about what happens to the astronauts. This is the space psychologist. They are heroes, but nobody prepared them to be back from the moon. They were put into a bunker, essentially. They couldn't touch their family. They couldn't hug them. Their family was afraid to hug them because they could be harboring disease or bacteria or foreign life. So coming back to that reality and kind of being literally behind the glass has affected them. Some of them lost their family. So she's coming up with a particular explanation as to why they were put in bunkers and all these things. But what's another model that could explain it if we're not affirming the consequent? There are many other things that could happen to these astronauts. And with such a small number of them that were that far away that allegedly went to the moon, there's a lot of possibility for weird things.
Right. Right. Exactly. So I won't say setting that aside, but in addition to that, we have complications surrounding the accepted story of what went on in order to get those guys to the moon. For example, the Van Allen radiation belt, and then also the claimed materials and the claimed heat exposure or heat put off by the Van Allen radiation belt.
Yeah. Like basically, was it possible
Right.
using that technology back then to get them past the Van Allen radiation belts? And there were like the danger zone that Van Allen talked about in 1961. He said, owing to the great penetrability of the high energy protons therein, effective shielding is quite beyond engineering feasibility in the near future. This is serious stuff. And we didn't hear astronauts complaining about the Van Allen radiation belt or having to deal with it back then. But now it's something that we hear NASA talking about.
Right.
There's a video that I quote where he says, this is something that we're going to have to deal with if we want to go there.
He says, if we're going to go there.
Let me find his exact quote.
Really? They say that now. What would that imply about the past quote going there, though?
He
That's
says,
the crazy thing.
We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. 2014, a NASA engineer, Kelly Smith. He's talking about, I work on navigation and guidance for NASA's Orion project. And as we get farther away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation.
And correct me if I'm wrong on that. The Van Allen radiation belt, per their own claims, is supposed to go around the entire Earth. There's not one region where there is no, quote, Van Allen radiation belt. Meaning that
you couldn't just escape it.
Right.
And I have never heard the claim that the astronauts somehow avoided it. I haven't heard that as a counter argument.
Right. So the argument is essentially that they went through it somehow.
That somehow they went through it. And the argument from another NASA astronaut, Don Pennant, he said, I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to. We destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
But even then, the technology, because I think you've done this with AI as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you've done this on your own. In either case, the materials that were used in the melting point of said materials is at odds with the claimed temperature and exposure of the Van Allen radiation belt. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I've heard that claim.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay, maybe I don't remember.
And people
where I
talk
saw
about that with regard to satellites as well in general.
Yeah.
That the material on the altitude, something doesn't line up with it.
Okay, maybe that's a new task for you with AI to ask about that.
Yeah.
The claimed materials and the melting point. I forget where I heard that then if it wasn't from you. But what are some of the other challenges with actually completing that mission to the moon?
Well, what comes to mind, I mean, it's not a challenge per se, but it's another reason for skepticism. It's in Bart Sibrel's video, a documentary, where he received footage from NASA where the astronauts were faking the image of Earth from the spacecraft. So anyone can watch his documentary.
What exactly went on?
So the astronauts were on a ship of some kind, and basically they were using a transparent piece of paper in the window with what appeared to be a not full circle. So it looked like it wasn't a fully lit up Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see that they were creating a false image of Earth from the craft. Mm-hmm. And they were speaking with what Sibrel supposes, he believes they're CIA agents or something, but who knows? Mm-hmm. They were speaking with someone about things. So it looked like it was a coordinated event. Mm-hmm. I quote in my book, a Supreme Court saying that fraud vitiates everything it touches. Mm-hmm. The idea is that if there's one example of fraud, then you have to basically, it ruins it.
Perfect example of that is some of the claim footage from the ISS where you can clearly see like mice running across the cabling and things like this, or like bugs or flies in some of the imagery.
Or things dropping while another thing's floating.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the best examples of that is where the astronaut tries to explain it, probably because so many skeptics were like, look, you're dropping stuff in these videos while the person's floating. He holds up a hammer in one hand and a playing card in another. So the hammer's floating. And he's like, look, on the ISS, we have these gravity pockets that we sometimes encounter. And so things will fall. Uh-huh. So he drops the card, it falls straight down, and the hammer's still floating. But there's a question because they're supposed to be traveling at like nearly 20,000 miles an hour, something's really high speed. So how would you know exactly where the gravity pocket's going to be, where something would fall? And again, it feels like a post hoc rationalization.
Does the gravity pocket remain constant inside the ship? You know,
very strange things. Like why would you want to show that? Like that the hammer's floating and this thing's falling. They're weird anomalies. And I'm not claiming that every video is fake or that everyone's in on it. Again, I don't know, but it's weird.
Yeah, because conversely, you could say that all you need is one genuine image or set of footage from the ISS in order to show that at least some of the footage from the ISS is genuine. But the point that I want to go back to is just because you have genuine footage from the ISS, that does not confirm the entirety of the accepted geocentric model. Again, especially because footage from the ISS isn't even claiming to show the entire globe. It's claiming to show just a portion of it based on the level at which the ISS is relative to the Earth, like how far away it is from the Earth. Right. So there may be showing, quote, curvature, but again, is that circular curvature or is that curvature where something is falling away from the horizon?
At the amount it should be from that altitude, given the radius value.
Exactly.
Another important anomaly is that what goes on with these alleged moon rocks. Mm-hmm. So in 2009, this was reported by the Telegraph. This isn't me just saying crazy stuff. A moon rock given to the Dutch Prime Minister by Apollo 11 astronauts in 1969 has turned out to be fake. The article talks about the Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, where the rock has attracted tens of thousands of visitors each year, discovered that the lunar rock, valued at 308,000 pounds, was in fact petrified wood. And another one, this was a woman who apparently had a moon rock that was the size of a gnat, and she had it trapped in a thick paperweight so that it couldn't be examined very easily. This was apparently given to her by her deceased Apollo engineer husband by Neil Armstrong as a souvenir. This was reported in findlaw.com 2009, where they're talking about court documents. The woman contacted the agency, meaning NASA, for help selling the rice-sized rock, in part to cover her son's medical bills. NASA organized a sting, detaining her in a Denny's parking lot and declining to let her use the restroom even as she wet herself.
What? NASA detained her?
Mm-hmm.
What the
For
hell?
having this tiny, tiny piece of alleged moon rock.
Why? That is so
It's
weird.
weird. It's
yeah,
weird.
that is really
It's weird.
strange.
Again, this doesn't prove that Earth is not a globe.
No, it's just
There's
question.
weird things happening.
Yeah, weird things, questions surrounding NASA. Okay, I want to emphasize again, I highly, highly, highly encourage you read Mark's book. Like, I cannot emphasize that enough. Is it on Audible yet or any audio?
Yeah, it's on Audible
Okay.
and Kindle. All my books, actually. Hard copy,
Okay.
Kindle, and Audible, and I
Okay.
narrate.
Who spoke in the Audible readings? Is
I
it you?
narrate all of them.
You narrate. You have a good voice, so
Thank
that's
you.
a good thing. Okay, awesome. I prefer the physical copy. You can find that here. So there's a number of things that we didn't get a chance to talk about as it relates to the book, but ultimately, as you do in all of your books, you trend towards consciousness, and we brought that up a little bit at around the middle of this episode, but I want to sort of end there because that's how you end there. So with your new understanding, again, using the neti neti principle, a method of seeking truth by falsification, now you have come to show that there are multiple ways to falsify the accepted heliocentric and globe spinning Earth model. How does that relate to consciousness, and how do you show how the two relate in your book?
Well, the cosmos and cosmology is based on a belief in something physical, that Earth and the things we see in the sky and anything that emerged from the alleged Big Bang, that there are physical particles involved in all this stuff. That if we look down far enough, we're going to see physical stuff that comprises everything we see around us. And there's reason to question that. And we're getting into basically metaphysical understandings. Most of science is based on what's known as scientific materialism, also called physicalism, or more generally known as realism. That there exists a real world.
You
outside.
discussed this in the book, realism versus idealism.
Yes.
Can you touch on that real quick?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, idealism is the idea that there exists no world or universe outside of consciousness. And there's a type of idealism proposed by Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. It's known as analytic idealism, in which you can have an individuated consciousness that's part of a collective.
Mm-hmm.
So his analogy is like whirlpools within a stream.
Right.
There's an Alec, there's a Mark. We have an individuated consciousness, but also a universal one.
Kind of relates to panentheism versus pantheism. Possibly.
It does.
Yeah.
These are like nuances within.
Yeah, nuance with it. Like panentheism would be that we are inextricably linked to God, but we are a distinct entity from God, and God is a distinct entity from us, but we are ultimately inextricably linked, fundamentally aspects of each other,
right,
in a way.
And also there's panpsychism, which has become more popular. And the most popular kind is known as constitutive panpsychism, is that consciousness emerges from little pieces of matter. When you put those little pieces of matter together, you end up with more complex consciousness, but it still starts with matter. Whereas idealism is that consciousness is the basis of reality. And there's no reality outside of consciousness, meaning outside of the full stream. There could be things that Alec is not perceiving in his whirlpool, or Mark is not perceiving in my whirlpool, but there's a broader consciousness.
Right.
And the philosophical argument he makes, which to me is, I think it's a really strong argument, because even people who are, let's say, even like self-proclaimed flat earthers, I'm finding, or just let's say globe skeptics or even geocentrists, they talk a lot about realism. They like presuppose realism, which I can understand why you want to do that. But the problem is that it is not as philosophically parsimonious as idealism is, meaning that using Occam's razor, the simplest solution, is usually the best. You should go with idealism. And the reason for it is, it's a profound one that your audience members might need to think about a lot as I say this. It's simple to say, but it took like a while for this to sink in for me. We cannot verify the existence of anything without experiencing it. Meaning you need to have a consciousness that's there to verify that something even exists in order to have direct evidence of its existence. Everything else is an inference. So the Big Bang heliocentric model is there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, billions of years of stuff happening, Earth revolving around the sun, Darwinian evolution, human being evolves, they develop brains, and consciousness pops out of their brain.
Mm-hmm.
That model is of materialism, of realism, is unverifiable.
Right. Totally unverifiable.
Because you would need a consciousness that could verify it. And some people say, well, you can see the light from the stars and they're traveling all these light years away.
No, you see light. You see light in the sky. That's what you see.
You see light and you presuppose a bunch of things to reverse engineer how far away they are and what they're comprised of. You see light in the present moment.
Right.
We can't even validate the past. The past there's a set of memories that we have in the present moment.
Right.
So under this line of thinking, we cannot verify the existence of anything outside of and independent of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So that means everything that's experienced is within consciousness, meaning the material world needs a consciousness in order to verify its existence.
Right.
So that it can explain reality as well as materialism without invoking this world that exists outside of all consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So both models could be correct, but you have to invoke what Kastrup calls a new ontological category of the material world outside of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that's an unnecessary leap, and it's a problematic leap, is that it's an unknown ontological category. It's something that is by definition unknown and unknowable and unverifiable because by definition it's something outside of all consciousness.
Right.
Whereas consciousness is an ontological category that we all know because we experience it right now. So it's something that we know, and we can stick with what we know and explain all of reality just with consciousness without invoking this mythical unicorn of a world outside and independent of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So that leaves us in a very dicey position because if all reality is consciousness at the core, then what is matter? And if we're asking what is matter, then we're asking what is the cosmos? What is Earth? What is someone's observation? A million things become possible, including things like the Mandela effect, where reality actually seems to have shifted. And like some examples include the Star Wars quote, "Luke, I am your father."
Yeah.
That's how most people remember it.
Right.
It's not that. It's "No, I am your father." Right. So the question becomes, is this collective misremembering or is it reality has shifted? And there are many other examples of the Mandela effect. I mentioned a few in the book, even biblical versus weird stuff shifting. I mentioned psychokinesis earlier, mind impacting matter, and the scientists like Dr. Dean Radin, Roger Nelson, who used to be at Princeton University studying this sort of thing. I don't know what to make of it. Reality, Earth, cosmology could be shifting, and it could be way more mystical than we realize, especially when we start getting into the realm of things like near-death experiences, people experiencing realities that are realer than real. They describe it as ineffable, meaning words do not adequately describe what they experienced. And people talk about this with psychedelics or meditation experiences, spiritually transformative experiences, which I've written about extensively in my earlier books, especially. How can we take a physicalist, realist, materialist view of cosmology seriously, which is what the mainstream is doing when they say 4% of the universe we know, 96% is this dark matter, dark energy stuff. And, well, we don't have a unifying theory of everything that can explain and reconcile the leading theories. They're leaving out consciousness as well in this stuff because they're physicists, which is the realm of the physical. And often I find they don't want to get into the metaphysical stuff because consciousness is, number one, it relates to neuroscience, but also it relates to philosophy. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think these disciplines need to be integrated much more wholly.
Right. Wow. Very well said. Very, very well said. And at the least, I think you and I can both agree on, maybe the people who are watching and listening to this, if you make a claim about a physical thing in reality, you need to validate that claim in accordance with the scientific method or some other form of empiricism that is controlling for variables and things like this. And it's okay to sit in "I don't know" after falsifying various tenets of an accepted model. And I think that for whatever reason, and I'm not going to say that I'm immune to this too, so many people struggle in sitting in the "I don't know" and just being like, I have no clue. But I find that the more that I can sit in the "I don't know" and have the humility to admit that when it comes to things, the more that I can come up with other plausible explanations for whatever it is that I'm referring to when I say I don't know. Because the more likely I am to set aside any preconceived ideas I might have to explore the plethora, the countless possibilities that are out there related to that specific thing. So I think it's healthy, and I think almost imperative that we learn to be okay in sitting in the I don't know. Because I think overwhelmingly it opens us up to exploring further on any given paradigm.
Very well said. And I think it's also important to explore models that we might not agree with or models that we think might be wrong, because there could be things to glean from them. So let's say there are elements of the mainstream flat earth framework that are incorrect, but it is interesting to consider a more local and smaller sun and moon that revolve around us in certain patterns. Just, it gets the mind going without having, so it's allowable to explore stuff and not have to be bound to it or even to talk about them. Yeah. And I also just want to give this is a really good summary quote, as I know we're getting to the end here, from a secret space program survivor. And this is a topic that has been interesting to me because I wrote my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, which is on contact with non-human intelligence. It gets in the UFO phenomenon. And inevitably, there are people who have these claims of being part of a secret space program, that they were mind controlled universally, I think. So they went through these MK Ultra programs, and then they were doing expeditions in outer space. So most of them are globe believers. They believe mainstream cosmology. The minute we introduce MK Ultra and mind control, we have to wonder. We don't know if memories are being implanted and so forth. But there was one secret space program survivor who had a very interesting quote, and I mentioned him in the book. This is what he says: "I've seen a lot of things, and it's hard to describe, even seeing it myself, because I can't tell you whether the way Earth looked was being played into my mind to make it look that way. I haven't gone out in my own craft with my friends where we're not tricking each other and then seen Earth, whether it's flat or round, but we're in a type of mental, spiritual, physical plane, and it reacts to how our consciousness perceives and expects it. Then Earth's shape is either or. It's whichever you look at it as, and it's way more complex than that."
That's a mic drop. Wow. Wow. Yeah, this just leaves me again in the I don't know. That's where I end up with this, is like the I don't know, and that's totally okay. I think it's healthy to be in the I don't know.
It's healthy. I think it reflects intellectual humility. We literally cannot know it all for all the reasons we discussed. And hopefully that will allow more conversations that are not as hostile as some of the ones that we see now, where people have a flag in their one camp and they want to demonize the other camp. We need to have more open conversations between human beings, and perhaps that will start to happen when people come into this place of I don't know, because there's too much contradictory evidence all over the place. And there doesn't seem to be one model where we've got it all. And we're all learning together.
Right. Well said. Thank you for joining me, man. This was epic, as always. I would have expected nothing less. This is an amazing conversation. And again, want to emphasize that, so I've read 3.5 of your books, let's say. I've read 3.5. And so far, and this is saying a lot, this is my favorite one, I think, because, and that's saying a lot, because I love An End to Upside Down Medicine. I love An End to Upside Down Liberty, and I've read half of that one that's sitting behind me. But the reason I love this one is because you're not coming from a perspective of forming an entire identity around this topic. You're just coming from the perspective of what we just shared here. I don't know. And let's look at this model and the mainstream claims surrounding it and see if they hold water. That's it.
Yeah.
And
to be clear, my second book, it's called An End to Upside Down Living. It has a picture of a globe on the cover, not to make a point. And in my podcast series, Where is My Mind?, I talk about how people used to think Earth is flat and now we know it's not, and Earth revolves around the sun. So it's not like I was born and was a flat earther or something. Like this is a new exploration. I'm exploring cosmology. I definitely was in the globe conventional cosmology camp for a long time. I remember at Princeton taking courses on physics and astrophysics and learning about the cosmic microwave background and the way that's perceived. Now I have different opinions on that. So it's not like this has been my whole identity. This was something very recently I started to look at, and I tried to compile what other people have critiqued about the mainstream model.
It's better that it's that case, and it's that case for thank most people who are questioning the globe, because it shows that you had to question your own preconceived ideas and even admit that you might have been wrong when it came to some of the claims you said previously, which I think shows an incredible level of humility. So it's amazing.
Yeah, same thing with germ theory. I used to think, I said it, I think in Upside Down Thinking, I talked about how we used to think we didn't know until we had a microscope that there existed these little things that could cause disease. So yeah, I'm continuing to question my presuppositions. I'm sure there are things I believe with high probability today that I will disagree with in the future.
Right.
But that's the process. I guess what's different is that when I do it publicly like this, I have to just acknowledge where I've been wrong.
It's good.
And it's my own journey.
It's good, man. Mark, you're the man. Thank you so much for joining me, man.
Thank you so much, Alec.